Ini kalau misalkan pakai
Halo semuanya, selamat malam. Selamat malam Pak Rudi, selamat malam Kak Irfan. Kita langsung mulai aja ya teman-teman. Halo Gaters, selamat datang di LPKGT Inkubator dalam kelas merancang visual multimedia dan fotografi bersama tenaga pelatih Bapak. Sebelumnya kami ucapkan terima kasih karena telah memilih LPKGT Inkubator sebagai tempat pelatihan Gaters dalam program Kartu Prakerja. Perkenalkan, nama saya M. Nadar Ridwan sebagai fasilitator yang akan membantu kegiatan hari ini selama 3 jam ke depan. Sebelum memulai kelas, izinkan saya menyampaikan beberapa prinsip K3, yaitu kesehatan, keamanan, dan keselamatan kerja. Maka jangan lupa selalu hindari dan meminimalisir potensi bahaya kecelakaan di sekitar kita, Gaters, seperti kebakaran, kerusakan peralatan elektronik, bocoran tabung, atau selang gas di dapur. Jadi, untuk Gaters yang mungkin sedang memasak atau menyetrika, sebaiknya ditunda terlebih dahulu dan fokus ikut pelatihannya untuk meminimalisir hal-hal yang tidak diinginkan terjadi. Untuk memulai kelas, izinkan saya menyampaikan beberapa aturan kelas yang harus diikuti oleh. Oke, peraturan peserta. Yang cara. Yang kelima, peserta boleh menyalakan audio atau mikrofon setelah diizinkan oleh fasilitator. Yang keenam, peserta wajib konfirmasi melalui kolom chat Zoom apabila izin ke toilet dan diperbolehkan mematikan kamera. Yang ketujuh, peserta dilarang berkata kasar dan menggiring opini yang tidak baik untuk peserta lain. Yang kedelapan, peserta dilarang mengakses materi atau link yang bukan diberikan oleh admin Getty. Selanjutnya, peserta wajib mengikuti rangkaian pelatihan dari awal hingga akhir, mulai dari pre-test, sesi pelatihan, formative test, tugas praktik mandiri, post-test, unjuk keterampilan yang terbagi dalam 5 hari. Yang kedua, peserta kartu prakerja yang memilih pelatihan daring webinar tidak memiliki kesempatan reschedule atau penjadwalan kelas. Yang ketiga, peserta dapat menggunakan fitur raise hand apabila ingin mengajukan pertanyaan seputar materi pelatihan. Yang keempat, peserta diperbolehkan bertanya apabila sudah diizinkan oleh fasilitator atau tenaga pelatih. Fasilitator akan mengizinkan peserta bertanya dari urutan raise hand pertama. Yang kelima, peserta diperbolehkan bertanya melalui kolom chat Zoom. Yang keenam, peserta wajib mengikuti arahan absensi dari fasilitator setiap 1 jam pelatihan berjalan. Yang ketujuh, serta wajib melengkapi absen yang diberikan oleh admin Getty di setiap akhir sesi. Oke, selanjutnya seperti biasa, kita mau dokumentasi absensi yang pertama. Kakak operator boleh pandu ya, Kak, untuk halo, Kakak operator, apakah ada di sini?
Baik,
Halo?
oke. Terima kasih kepada Kananda, Pak Rudi, dan Petrus. Kita langsung saja ya dengan sesi foto pertama di sesi kelima ini. Hitungan 3, 2, 1. Baik, terima kasih kepada Kananda dan Pak Rudi dan Geta. Silakan dilanjutkan untuk materi.
Oke, terima kasih Kakak operator. Kak Irfan, ini hari terakhir ya, Kak ya. Semangat terus, Kak, untuk semoga berkah. Amin.
Siap.
Pak Rudi, silakan Pak, dilanjutkan
Ya,
untuk
selamat
kelas.
malam semuanya. Selamat malam Mas Nanda, Kak Irfan. Luar biasa nih. Sampai sesi terakhir. Keren banget Mas Irfan. Ini kita ada share yang PR kemarin ya Mas Irfan. Jadi begini Mas. Kalau untuk foto itu kan jadi satu kesatuan antara komposisi sama warna. Jadi kalau misalnya ambil foto udah tahu kira-kira nih komposisinya apa gitu. Kira-kira dari Mas Irfan komposisinya apa nih Mas yang ini Mas?
Enggak, Pak.
Ya udah gini aja. Jadi kalau misalnya itu kan komposisi kan banyak. Jadi kalau misalnya dalam komposisi Mas Irfan pahami dan perdalam hanya rule of third dulu. Rule of third dulu, pahami terus, syuting itu terus aja sampai dapat feel-nya. Oh, posisi ini enak, posisi enak. Baru komposisi berikutnya gitu, Mas. Mm-mm. Jadi kalau misalnya udah paham dari satu komposisi, baru ke next berikutnya gitu. Jadi bisa lebih enak gitu. Kalau misalnya kayak begini, kita ngelihat fokusnya rada rancu. Kira-kira mau yang mana nih? Gitu. Soalnya kan ini emang bentuk uh, repetition, tekstur, tapi kurang kurang fokus gitu. Jadi kebanyakan ini elemen yang kita nggak bisa ngeliat fokusnya di mana gitu. Jadi kita sebenarnya mengarahkan kepada audiens kira-kira yang pertama kali lihat yang mana gitu. Itulah fungsinya dari fokus pointnya. Nah, terus yang kedua, ini kan Mas ada 3 gambar, berarti Mas ganti untuk white balance-nya ya. Ini yang biru 7.000, ini 5.000, ini yang 5.000 ya.
Yang 5.000 ya.
Iya. Oke, good. Ya udah nanti tinggal diperdalam aja latihan ininya Mas, fotonya.
Oh, siap.
Kalau misalnya ada awan begini, emang lebih baik tuh pagi kalau nggak sore. Gitu. Nanti kita belajar bareng-bareng untuk foto yang sesi ini. Oke Mas, terima kasih Mas Irfan. Kita balik ke ini materi. Dari yang tugas itu ada yang mau ditanyakan Mas Irfan?
Udah ada, Pak.
Nggak ada ya,
Tadi...
baik. Bentar. Oke, baik. Kita sekarang ke sesi kelima, sesi terakhir. Sekarang kita melakukan fokus untuk kelasnya penerapan teknik kamera dan fotografi. Di sini kita ada pemahaman tentang teknik kamera, teknik pemotretan, penerapan dalam fotografi, eksperimen dan kreativitas, praktek dan latihan. Nah, kita ada yang namanya sebenarnya natural light. Natural light itu ada blue hour. Nah, blue hour kurang lebih itu berkisar pada 1 jam sebelum matahari terbit. Itu antara jam 5 sampai jam 6. Jadi sebelum matahari terbit itu kita udah standby. Dan 1 jam setelah matahari terbenam. Jam 6 sampai jam 7 ya. Nah, pada saat-saat ini, matahari yang di bawah horizon membentuk semburan pada langit dengan gradasi warna biru hingga ungu atau kemerahan. Nah, sangat sesuai untuk foto model, prewed, atau outdoor.
I like the reflection, and I like that there's a certain element of symmetry.
Blue hour is the time just after sunset when there's still some light left in the sky. When shooting with a long exposure, it's impossible to hold the camera steady that long, so we have to secure it to a tripod. This lens is the ultra-wide Nikkor 10 to 24mm DX. We want to use this lens to shoot the temple because there's this great expansiveness and drama here, and we want to be able to capture it with minimal distortion. You know, you want your lens to be straight on the horizon.
Yeah.
Okay, so that looks pretty good to me. And with the DX 1.5 times crop factor, at the widest, our 10mm lens becomes approximately 15mm. so there's our shot, okay?
Yeah.
So it looks good. We got blue hour happening,
Yeah.
okay? So you see, even though it looks like it's totally dark in the sky, there's still a heap of light in there.
Yeah, I see the blue hour, yeah. The sky is nicely lit up, and I think it's capturing it well.
So not only is this a great lens for shooting landscapes, but I really like using this lens for shooting interiors, architecture, and cityscapes.
Ini dapat ya blue hour-nya, jadi bisa pakai ASA 100, ASA 200. Nah, bukaan 8 ini untuk dapat field of view-nya, jadi tidak ngeblur ya. Nah, terus untuk 8 second atau 5 second itu tergantung dari lighting-nya sebenarnya, tergantung dari pencahayaannya pada jam tersebut. Nah, ini pakai lensanya 10 mm. 10 mm ini lensanya wide ya, sangat-sangat lebar sekali, sangat cocok buat foto pemandangan. Oke. Nah, terus ada lagi golden hour. Golden hour berkisar pada 1 jam setelah matahari terbit, jam 6 sampai jam 7, atau 1 jam sebelum matahari terbenam, jam 5 sampai jam 6. Pada kisaran waktu ini, sinar matahari kita terima terdiffuse lebih banyak oleh lapisan atmosfer, sehingga intensitasnya turun, gradasi yang lembut, dan memiliki warna yang hangat atau warm. Nah, sangat sesuai untuk potret, landscape, cityscape, portrait, dan sebagainya.
What is going on, guys? It is Raf once again, and today we're going to be discussing keys to better golden hour photography. Now, if your outdoor photos have been looking a little flat and, let's be honest, boring, maybe you haven't heard of the magical time of day when it's nearly impossible to take a bad photo. Photographers in the know call it golden hour, the hour following sunrise and the hour before sunset. So wait, that's actually 2 hours a day you can and should be out there with your camera, shooting pictures in the day's most gorgeous light. Okay, so what's so great about golden hour? Shadow play. The sun is lower in the sky, which will throw you some interesting shadows, far more interesting than the harsh light of the midday sun. Shadows give you a dimension and pizzazz. The quality of light is also great during these times. The light just after sunrise and before sunset is softer, which will make your images softer too. The colors will be warmer, deeper, and richer, and you'll catch that soothing vibe in your photos. If you're shooting portraits, the soft light will be more flattening on your subject. Now, the sun's light is directional as it's rising or setting, and you'll want to take full advantage. Move around or move your subject around to snap a picture that's backlit by the sun. Try lighting your subject from the side. Let the sun shine directly on your subject and see what you think. Grab a reflector to bounce the light around a bit, creating some nice soft fill lighting. You have more options when the sun throws light in a particular direction, not beating down on the top of your head. More choices equals more creativity. Now, we have about 6 steps that will help you during your golden hour shoot. Step 1's a pretty obvious one. Don't be late. You'll want to know when the sun rises or sets on the day you're planning to go out shooting. That way, you can give yourself enough time to get to your location. Download an app to your phone which will tell you the daily sunrise and sunset times. Show up early to get the lay of the land. Get a few ideas of what you'd like to shoot. Clean up a little if you see trash lying around. It might be nice to have the location all to yourself, so take the opportunity to beat the crowds at sunrise. If you want landscapes, there will be fewer people up and around that early, wandering into your shot. Step 2 is pretty important. Position yourself for the best use of the light. You'll find what you like best for your own images, but there are a few tried and true ways to use the sun's position to get you started. For portraits, move your subject so that the sun's light hits from the side. You want to do this to avoid front lighting so the person isn't squinting. Side lighting is also called split lighting because half of your subject will be lit while the other half is in a shadow. The result is a more dramatic and dynamic image. Put your subject between you and the sun for the more mystical glow of backlighting. If parts of your subject are more translucent, the light behind it can shine through for a more striking effect. Leaves and branches on a tree and feather foliage stand out more with the sunlight shining through them. If you want to create silhouettes in your frame, expose your shot correctly for the image's brighter part, that is, the sky. Shapes in the foreground will be underexposed, so they'll be darker. Silhouettes lend your landscape with a bit of mystery and drama, which is an opportunity you'll have during golden hour. Be sure to try the same shot from a few different angles to keep your creative juices flowing. Learning how to use a light is the most valuable skill in photography, so get all the experience that you can. Step 3, and this one's a no-brainer. Choose the right camera settings. For the best control over your backlit exposure, shoot in manual mode. If you let your camera make all the decisions in automatic mode, you might find that your subject comes out too dark. Another practical setting on your camera is aperture priority. You can change the aperture, and your camera adjusts shutter speed and ISO accordingly. If you're using autofocus, go into the camera menu or find the shortcut button on your camera and select spot metering. That way the camera will expose the focal point of your image correctly. Remember that portraits with a single subject are often best when shot with a low aperture, like f2.8 or lower. If you're shooting more than one person, use a narrow aperture to ensure all faces are in focus. If you're shooting at sunset, bump up the ISO a bit as the light decreases so you can continue shooting in aperture priority. Step 4. Choose your shadows carefully. When you're shooting a portrait, avoid unflattening shadows on your subject's face. Any light coming from above your subject will create dark shadows under and around their eyes. When you're shooting the landscape, shadows can add depth, texture, and detail to your image. Remember to be mindful of your own shadow when the sun is behind you. You might not want that in your image. Shadows can give a cooler contrast to the warmer reds, oranges, and yellows of golden hour. Have fun with them. Of course, you gotta have some fun while you're taking photos. So step 5, capture that cool starburst effect. Give your photos an otherworldly spark with this optical trick.
Jadi kalau di golden hour itu bagusnya waktu ada spark di cahaya mataharinya benar-benar kelihatan tembus dari awan. Jadi itu bisa digunakan efek yang natural untuk foto di model atau foto di benda gitu. Karena ini udah mataharinya mulai tenggelam gitu kan. Jadi bagusnya di golden hour ini emang memanfaatkan cahaya mataharinya langsung itu, gitu. Oke. Nah, terus ada cahaya pagi dan sore. Cahaya matahari pada waktu pagi jam 7 sampai jam 10 dan sore jam 2 sampai jam 5. Nah, bisa digunakan untuk motret cityscape dan landscape dengan langit yang kurang biru dibandingkan dengan blue hour. Nah, perhatikan arah cahaya untuk mengandalkan efek bayangan agar sesuai dengan yang diinginkan. Pada jam-jam ini, Anda bisa menggunakan backlight untuk motret orang. Jadi bisa siluet ya, kayak yang tadi. Nah, biasanya kalau untuk foto prewed juga, ini kan fotonya jam 7 sampai jam 10. Nah, jam 10 sampai jam 2 ini waktunya istirahat sama retouch gitu. Nah, mulai lagi nanti jam 2 sampai jam 5 gitu. Nah, cahaya tengah siang matahari. Nah, sinar matahari pada tengah siang memiliki karakter yang tajam, keras, dan kontras dengan arah yang hampir tegak. Foto yang dihasilkan dengan sinar langsung matahari pada jam-jam ini umumnya kurang enak dilihat. Hindari memotret di siang hari antara jam 10 sampai jam 2. Atau gunakan diffuser untuk melembutkan cahaya masuk. Apabila prewed, ini waktunya untuk istirahat, retouch, dan tunggu sampai jam 2 siang.
Before you grab that flash, here are 5 natural light techniques that are guaranteed to level up your portrait photography. Number 1, find shade. This one's easy, and most of you probably already do this. All you're gonna do is move your subject from that hard and unflattering direct light and bring them into the shade. Once there, face them towards a light source, like the sky, clouds, or even a window to create a soft and flattering flat light on their skin. With that simple adjustment, we've already gone from images like this to this. Number 2, refine your shade lighting. Not all shade is equal. And now that you got your subject standing in the shade, work them into a position where you can find a natural hair light entering from the back of the scene. I want you to frame your subject against a darker background so that natural hair light pops. With that simple adjustment in positioning and in-camera framing, now you've set up a 3-light portrait using only natural light. Number 3, scrim hard light sources. When you have a nasty hard light entering your scene like we did here, grab your reflector. Inside is a scrim. Grab that scrim and flag off the light source. Not only can you block that light, but you can also use your scrim and subject positioning to turn that hard light source into a large key light on your subject like you see here. This one's crazy because the only difference in the before versus the after is having that scrim in place. Number 4, scrim to modify the color of a light source. I love looking for natural reflectors. These are objects that you can find in the environment that naturally throw light. But in this case, this wall that was bouncing nice light into my subject's face was too warm because the color of the wall was very warm. So to clean up the light source, we're using the white side of that same reflector to simply place against the wall. And this cleans up and kind of neutralizes the color of that warm light source. Finally, number 5, you don't always need to expose your frames bright so your skin tones are properly exposed. Instead, play with darker exposures. In this case, we're in a bathroom using the natural light coming through the stained glass window to play with the highlights. We're using those highlights as well as our subject's pose to draw attention to form and figure. Expose darker, use the highlights to create interesting silhouettes, and don't be afraid to play.
Oke. Nah, lalu ada juga ray of light. Ray of light adalah istilah yang digunakan untuk berkas sorotan sinar. Nah, efek ini muncul pada sinar yang melewati celah-celah dan kemudian melalui partikel di udara. Bisa berupa asap, kabut, uap, air, debu, dan sebagainya. Nah, Anda bisa memanfaatkan ray of light untuk menambah kesan dramatis pada foto yang dihasilkan.
Backlit, and of course we've got this spray that's coming up and the light is hitting it. Like if I block the light, you'll see that's where it is right now. It's backlighting everything. I've got this bounce light under the bridge, I've got backlight on these branches, I've got light rays, and it's lighting this water absolutely majestically. With a shot like this, you can't go wrong. You just got to show up, get the right settings and take the shot and keep on shooting. That is juice factor 11.
This second shot of the day might actually be my favorite.
Cahaya yang tembus dari celah-celah pohon dan jembatan.
As I mentioned earlier, I always tend to work further into a scene with tighter focal lengths to really feature my favorite aspects of a scene. And in this case, I love the balance between the bridge, the light rays, and the waterfall. And again, I wanted to capture a lot of texture in the water with only a little bit of motion blur, and it turned out that half a second was the ideal shutter speed, which is a little bit longer than I actually would have expected. What you're looking at here is actually a single exposure, and surprisingly I managed to get all of the dynamic range that I needed out of this single raw file, which did surprise me because of how contrasty the light was, but it turned out to be an easy image to process. And if you compare this image to the first shot of the day, you'll definitely notice that this one has a much warmer tone to the light, simply because the sun dropped lower in the sky as it reached towards golden hour, which I guess we call it golden hour for a good reason.
Oke, tadi untuk ray of light. Nah, terus ada juga lampu incandescence atau bohlam. Nah, ambient light buatan ini memiliki karakter warna yang hangat, cenderung orange atau kemerahan. Nah, Anda bisa menggunakan sumber cahaya ini dengan mengatur white balance pada posisi auto incandescence. Ini lampu-lampu bohlam ya, biasa kita temuan di kafe gitu ya.
Hi, this is JP Morgan. Today on The Slanted Lens, we're going to talk about what should be a simple principle but can be kind of complicated to apply. We're going to talk about how you combine your practical or tungsten lights in a room or on your set with your strobes and how you combine those two together. It's a very simple equation. On the exposure triangle, both the strobes and the tungsten lights are controlled by the ISO, but your aperture is going to control your strobes and your shutter is going to control your practical lights. So let's apply this on set and just see what we get when we try to control our strobes with the aperture and all these light bulbs with our shutter speed. If you'll balance the room lights with your strobes, it really gives the room a lot of warmth and depth. It gives the room a sense of being lived in. It makes it look more real. So it's really important to give life to those practicals by giving them an exposure. So let's see how we can do that. So when you're shooting and you have two light sources, your strobes and the practical lights in the room like lamps and other tungsten, let's look at the exposure triangle because it's going to help us understand how to balance these two different light sources when we're shooting with two light sources in the same room. Our exposure triangle has three parts: ISO, shutter, and aperture. The ISO controls the scene overall. As we raise it up or down, we're going to get more or less exposure. It affects both the light bulbs in the shot and the strobes equally. This leaves us two areas in the exposure triangle that allow us to control two different light sources, the shutter speed and the aperture. The shutter speed affects the light bulbs or tungsten lights, and the aperture controls the strobes. Let's talk about why that is. In a dark room where there's very little ambient light, the shutter speed does not affect the strobes. You know, it can be long or short, it just has no effect on the strobes. The flash duration of the strobes is too fast to be affected by the shutter speed. The only exception to this rule is that faster shutter speeds, faster than 1/80th of a second, they're going to start to clip the flash duration of the strobes and darken the image. But most of the time when we're balancing light bulbs or the practicals in the room with the strobes, we're going to want longer shutter speeds, and so this is not a problem. So the strobes are not affected by the shutter speed, so the aperture is going to control the strobes. If I turn my strobes on, I get a reading of f8 at my subject, and with the light meter, I set the camera's aperture to f8. The light bulbs in the room at a 1/60th of a second are going to be way too dark, so we're going to need to lengthen that shutter speed. I now lengthen the shutter speed until I get a correct exposure on the practical lights or light bulbs in the room. It's a very simple equation. Let's take a look at an example. My strobe exposure is f14, the shutter speed is 1/50th of a second. His face has a correct exposure, but the light bulbs are a little dark. I want to make them brighter and not affect his face. I'm going to lengthen the exposure to see what it does to the light bulbs. Here we are at 1/25th of a second, twice as much time, so obviously they're brighter. We're going to go to 1/13th of a second. Obviously the bulbs are getting brighter. He's away from the bulbs, not standing next to them, so the light bulbs are not affecting his face at all. Here's 1/6 of the shutter speed and it's starting to blow out. When we're using a high aperture like f14, we're going to need a very long exposure for those light bulbs. But remember, we're looking at these light bulbs, we're looking at the filament of the light bulbs, so it's like looking directly at the flash tube. If this was in a lamp, it would need to be much longer because we're not looking at the direct light source, we're looking at the effect of the light source. I'm going to 1/25th of a second, and for me that looks the best. It's really a matter of personal opinion, but I like 1/25th of a second. Let's move on to our shoot. We did a shot combining light bulbs with strobes, and let's see what we've got. We hung 30 light bulbs from cords in the shot. 30 sounds like a lot, but it wasn't as many as I thought it would be. These are old-fashioned light bulbs. They're fun to work with. You see that really fun filament inside the bulb? I wanted to have a black and white image. Black cords with white lights, black hair with our model, and the white dress had some black accents. She's standing in the middle of the light, so the shorter I can make my shutter, the less exposure I'm going to get from the light bulbs on her face. I'm on a Tamron 70 to 200mm lens. My focal length is about 120mm. It's slightly long. My aperture is f6.3 because I want a shallow depth of field so the light bulbs will go out of focus in the background. I started making exposures at 1/4 of a second and shortened them until I got the best exposure. Here's my image at 1/50th of a second. The exposure is almost too long. I'm starting to see just a little bit of light on her face, but I think I'm okay. I'm going to move forward at 1/50th of a second. I then added the background strobes. I dialed the power down on those until they look good as a white background. I then added a flex flash up front with an octadome that has a grid on it. It's going to come from underneath because I want it to look like the soft glow of the lights on her face. I then added another flex flash as a rim light on her. It's got a 7-inch reflector with a 40-degree grid in it. Here are some of the final images from this setup. Just to change things up, I then added a blue gel to the background light and shot some more images. I added a 39-inch reflector just to add a little bit of fill on her face. Here's some of the final images from this setup. It's not a hard concept to grasp, but a hard principle to apply. This principle is the same for sunsets, outside lights at night, lamps, any kind of constant light source. Aperture controls the strobe, the shutter controls the secondary or constant light source.
Yaitu penggabungan antara strobes sama light bulb ya. Karena pencahayaan dari light bulb itu dari bohlam, itu sebenarnya menghasilkan warna yang kuning. Makanya dibantu sama strobes. Strobes itu kayak lampu studio. Oke. Nah, terus ada lagi lampu fluoresen. Lampu fluoresen ini sering disebut dengan lampu TL. Sangat umum digunakan karena memiliki efisiensi yang lebih baik dari lampu bohlam. Ciri khas lampu ini adalah adanya lonjakan spektrum warna hijau. Sebagian besar lampu fluoresen berwarna putih, cool daylight, CT antara 5.500 sampai 6.500 Kelvin. Dan juga ada yang dirancang dengan warna warm sehingga mirip dengan bohlam. Nah, gunakan white balance yang sesuai untuk motret di bawah jenis pencahayaan ini. Ambient light, jenis cahaya dalam fotografi, fluorescent light, dan cool light.
What's the big deal with this fluorescent light after all? For starters, it's very soft and flattering light that molds to your subject almost effortlessly. It's great for subjects who struggle with flashes, and, well, I could go on, but I'll let you decide for yourself by showing you how to put it to work. If you've taken a class in lighting or read a lot of textbooks, you've been taught that common household fluorescent lighting fixtures will not work well for studio photography. We're told it is because of the flicker. You see, fluorescent bulbs are gas-filled tubes. The gas is charged by electric pulses from a ballast, which in turn creates visible light. Because of the pulses, the lights are rapidly turning on and off. This happens fast enough that we generally don't see it with our eyes, but since the camera shutter works at a very fast speed, over the course of several frames, you will notice that not only does the exposure change, but the color quality also changes due to the pulsing of the light. The more expensive KinoFlow lights use a different type of ballast that allows them to operate at a higher than standard lamp current and a higher frequency, hence eliminating the flicker. In the last video, I promised to give you the secret to eliminating the effect of the flicker with the inexpensive lights. And I will, at the end of this video. First, let's talk about how to use the setup. A quick note about color balance. As you know, fluorescent light falls in the pale green portion of the color spectrum. I mentioned in the first video that I use the cheapest fluorescent tubes that I can find. The reason for this is not just to save money, it's also because the fluorescent color balance setting on your camera is designed to work best with the cheap fluorescent lighting that we find in schools and office buildings. Now I have two basic arrangements that I use for most of the shots that I do with these lights. The first setup is traditionally called butterfly lighting. You can always identify butterfly lighting by the unique strip-like catch lights that you'll see in your subject's eyes. I place one of the 6 tube rigs on each side of the subject's face. This provides a beautiful and soft light that is flattering to almost any shape, face, and skin tone. Then from behind the subject, I add one rim light on each side. These rim lights provide a very subtle and pleasing highlight on the jawline. In this sample shot, the background is just a white wall that is 6 feet behind the subject. As you can see, it turns to a muddy gray without any lights dedicated to the background. There are an almost infinite number of possibilities for this background scenario with these lights. So I will show you just a few of mine with a few twists that you may not have considered on your own. The easiest way to lighten the white background is to move it closer. Here you see a white background placed just about 1.5 feet behind my subject. The background is brighter, but still not very exciting. This is where I like to have some fun and mix light sources. But remember, there are no rules, so don't tell me it's not good to mix light sources. Let's go back to using the wall as a background and add a Paul C. Buff Alien B400 as a background light. Keep in mind, even though this strobe is only 160 watt-seconds, it is much more powerful than the fluorescent lights. So I have it dialed all the way down to its lowest power setting. Now you see a clean white background. I used the same exposure setting and same color balance setting as in the previous shots. Now this is where some of you who feel that every shot has to be technically perfect and follow the rules will feel like your head is about to explode. We've already established that the fluorescent light is kind of a pale green. Electronic flash falls into the blue portion of the spectrum. But since the white background is bright and since we have the flash dialed way down so as not to throw light all over the room, all that happens is that the background blows out and you wind up with a nice high-key background. If you want to get creative, you can turn the flash way up and really blow the background out for an even more dramatic effect. Or we can switch to a black background with no flash. Or turn the flash all the way down and throw a blue gel over the flash.
Oke, tadi untuk yang fluorescent light. Nah, terus ada juga sumber cahaya dari api. Lampu minyak, lilin, obor, dan beberapa benda lain. Memancarkan sebagian hasil dari api pembakaran. Nah, intensitas dari pencahayaan dengan api umumnya sangat lemah, dengan warna yang sangat warm. Anda memerlukan pengaturan exposure yang tepat untuk kondisi yang menyerupai low light. Sangat disarankan menggunakan lensa dengan aperture lebar. Hal ini yang sebaiknya diperhatikan adalah white balance. Sebaiknya diatur secara manual pada temperatur 1700 sampai 2500. Untuk fluorescent light, bohlam, sama api, ini memang cahayanya agak sedikit kurang kalau seandainya hanya 1 atau 2 saja. Nah, itu bisa dibantu dengan strobes atau lampu studionya itu, gitu. Oke, jadi penggabungan cahaya yang kecil ini bisa sebagai fill, nah terus strobes-nya bisa sebagai main light. Oke.
I work with live fire. Like I say, a little bit of it is about just the experience of having it done. I mean, you are trying to not only create dynamic images, but you're trying to create a buzz for your studio. In doing it in this fashion, we use a long exposure, and it's similar to things you may have seen done with sparklers or steel wool. We actually freeze the subject with the strobes, and then we paint with the fire over about a 10-second exposure. One thing I want to mention for sure with working with fire is you have to be very careful. We are going to show you how to do this the safe way to keep anyone from getting hurt. You got to realize whether you're shooting newborns or high school seniors, somebody has entrusted you with the safety of their child. So no matter how cool the photo is, do not take any chances. It's never worth scarring somebody for life. What we're going to work with tonight is going to be a very, very small flame built onto a little torch on a long handle. And we're going to paint over a long exposure rather than light up an entire area of flame. The fire is going to be so far away from the model on this, she doesn't even feel the heat. And if she is feeling the heat, that's going to freak her out. Her expression's going to go bad. So we want to be sure that we're keeping a safe distance from her and we're doing this as safely as possible. So as far as the torch goes, this is as low tech as it gets. What we've got here is an old broom handle I had sitting around the house and used rag and some wire to wire it on with. So we're just gonna wrap that around there and wire it because it's anything else that you tie it with is gonna burn. So we just wrap it around there, wire it on, and then we're gonna saturate it with some tiki torch fluid. I don't like to use gasoline or things that have a much higher combustible rate because the flame, it's a lot harder to control. You're actually going to see with these images that we get a better shot when the flame's lower and more controllable because, like I say, anything too bright and it overexposes and it gets hard to control. One thing I should point out is when you saturate your torch with tiki torch fluid or lamp oil, do that someplace far away from where you're going to be shooting because you don't want a puddle of combustible fluid on the ground below where you're going to be painting with fire. That's just a recipe for disaster. If you haven't done this type of photography before at night, you're going to want to set your camera up so that it's on a tripod, set the model where she's going to be or your subject, get a focus on the model, and then turn your focus over to manual. We're using a wireless remote trigger. That way the camera doesn't have to hunt for focus. Every time you push the button, the strobes are going to go off. We're working with our radio popper wireless triggers. So we've got no cords, seeing as how we're going to be running around in the dark. We're working in complete darkness here because any ambient light is going to give you ghosting in your image. So the strobes are going to go off, freeze the subject. We're going to paint with fire. We can't have interference with ambient light. All right, that's looking good. Here we go. Ready? 1, 2, and 3. Pop. Okay. Good. And we haven't explained this to Brittany yet, but she's doing fantastic. She's got to hold perfectly still because during that 10-second exposure, if she moves, we end up with a shadow between where the fire was painted behind her and where she now is.
Itu dari lighting dari fire ya, dari api. Terus ada lighting style. Lighting style itu ada high key, low key, sama graduate tonality. Nah, perbandingannya adalah perbandingan cahaya terang dan gelap kecil sehingga kontrasnya rendah untuk yang high key. Untuk yang low key, perbandingan cahaya terang dan gelap besarnya sehingga kontrasnya tinggi. Ada juga graduate tonality. Perbandingan cahaya antara gelap dan rendah memiliki nilai sedang sehingga terdapat gradasi terhadap kontras. Berikut contoh untuk high key dan low key. Jadi high key untuk histogramnya lebih ke arah kanan dan low key lebih ke arah kiri. High key itu lebih ke arah terang, low key itu lebih ke arah gelap.
Between high key and low key lighting. So what do those terms mean? Fundamentally, high key lighting is when an image is made up of predominantly lighter tones. So in other words, there's not too much in the way of shadows. However, when you go to a low key image, it means most of the image is predominantly darker tones, more shadows, a lot of depth and dimension. So when I'm thinking about the moods created by these two styles of lighting, I'm thinking high key means bright or happy, upbeat, ethereal. Any of those descriptors are a perfect indication of when I'd want to grab high key lighting. And now let's go to the opposite side. Let's go with low key. I think of dramatic, sculptural, dark, mysterious. And so if that's what I'm looking for out of a photograph, well then I gravitate to low key lighting. You can create high key or low key lighting no matter how many pieces of gear you have. So even if you just have natural light, 1 strobe, 2 strobes, or 10 strobes, you can use the light and shape the light to be either a high key look or a low key look. All right, so what I'd like to do in this video is take you through how I use 2 strobes and I make little changes to take the image from something really glowing and really high key to suddenly really dark and dramatic. All right, let's talk about the lighting. We're going to begin with our main light. Now, if I want to create a high key image, I need to create minimal shadows. And to do that, I want to have my main light more centered on my subject's face, a little bit flatter on, because that reduces the amount of shadows. And so right now I have my beauty dish placed in a paramount lighting position. Paramount means that the shadow underneath her nose is small and centered. All right, so I've got that position of light. Now I've chosen a beauty dish because a beauty dish is both soft and flattering on the skin, but adds a little bit more pop and contrast to the image. So we're going to begin there with strobe number 1. Okay. All right, so you can see that there are minimal shadows on her face. There's still a little bit underneath the chin and nose, but we're going to talk about that in a moment. But fundamentally, what's making this image not high key, what's making it a little bit darker, is the background. Now, even though I have chosen a savage super white background, because of fall off of light, it looks dark, it looks gray. So in order to achieve a white background in this instance, I'm going to add my second strobe, which is a bare bulb. It's a strobe with no modifiers at all, and that's going to evenly light the background to give me that high key look I'm going for. All right, now let's take a shot. All right, so now that is moving us much closer to the high key look. All right, now where else do you see shadows? If my goal is high key, well, I'm looking and I see some shadows underneath the chin, maybe a little bit underneath the nose. Now these are not necessarily bad. Shadows add sculpting, they add dimension, they add shape to the face, so I don't necessarily mind these shadows. But let's say that I want to go super glowing and high key and ethereal. Well, this is an opportunity to add a reflector. Now popping that reflector underneath her chin, I can have a white reflector just to lift up and soften the shadows a little bit, or silver if I really want to eliminate those shadows and give me a little bit more contrast to the image. So in the first shot, I've used a white reflector. And you'll notice that the shadows are brightened a bit, but you don't really notice the reflector is there. Just kind of lifts up the shadows. But now, when I switch over to a silver reflector, you'll see bright catch lights in her eyes and a lot more contrast and light to fill in those shadows. Neither one is right or wrong. It just depends on what you're going for. So the lighting setup that we have here is one of the most common beauty lighting setups, and it is called clamshell lighting. One light lighting the face and a second light below, so the subject's head is like the pearl and the clam. Essential clamshell lighting, high key because of the white background and minimal shadows. Now before I shoot, I do want to talk a little bit about my camera gear, and I am shooting with the Canon R5, and my lens choice is the RF 85mm 1.2. This is many photographers' go-to portrait lens because it has beautiful compression. And when I want to grab a narrow depth of field, I mean that 1.2 lens is sharp and beautiful. All right, so now I've got that beautiful high key lighting, got the right camera gear, so let me grab the shot. Okay, you look great. Perfect. Can you give me a couple with smiles, a couple giggles? Good. So cute. Okay, so we've got some beautiful high key shots. Now it's time to go the exact opposite, and we need to introduce some shadows and some drama. All right, so let's begin first by removing the reflector. All right, so that gives us a little bit more shadows, but that's not nearly dramatic enough. Now, right now I have that white background. I know that I'm not going to want the background to be pure white, so I am going to use the background light, but let me turn it off for the time being until we get our main light in place. Let me just flip that off. All right, so there are several different ways that I can introduce more shadows through the main light. One of the ways is to move the light further off to the side. That introduces more shadows and more dimension. But I want to show you one of my favorite ways to create more shadow in image, and that is adding a grid. So what grids do fundamentally is they narrow the beam of light. They prevent the spread of the light. Now, what it also has a side effect of doing is it makes it so that less light will reach the background. I have many tutorials that go much more in depth into grids. So I'm going to begin by adding a grid to my beauty dish. So not only did I turn the background light off, but when I add the grid to the beauty dish, that background is going to go nearly black. So I've darkened the background. We've gotten rid of the fill reflector, but how can I make this even more low-key, even more dramatic? What we're going to do is we're going to create something called short light. That means when I move that main light further around to the side, at some point, the shadows are actually pointed towards camera instead of away. The reason it's called short light is the light on her face, the actual illumination, it appears short, like it's smaller. And so I'm going to move that light all the way around to the side, and it's going to create a ton of shadow and a ton of sculpting. Great, and then we turn this way for me. Perfect, right there, great. So let me grab a shot. Beautiful, that's perfect. All right, so let's take a look at the changes here. Now, when I move the light off to short light position, you can see that there's still beautiful exposure, beautiful light on her face, but there is a lot of shadow now, which of course is moving us far in that direction of low key. But you'll also notice that the background appears black. Now, in the previous shot, the background was a little bit of a darker gray, and that's because some of the main light was still reaching that white background. But now that we move the light off to the side, all of the light is kicking the opposite direction of the background, and so it becomes pure black.
Ya itulah untuk high key dan low key. Lalu ada juga kita membentuk dengan 3-point lighting. 3-point lighting adalah pembagian untuk foto dengan 3 sumber cahaya. Yang satu dengan key light, yang satu dengan fill light, yang satu lagi dengan backlight. Key light atau main light itu yang utama. Fill light itu sebagai lampu pengisi. Backlight itu untuk lampu yang di belakang. Biasanya backlight itu disebut juga rim light. Karena itu membentuk suatu shape untuk objek yang difoto. Nah, cara pengaturan pencahayaan 3 titik. Sumber cahaya diberi label seperti key light digunakan sebagai titik pencahayaan utama Anda. Fill light digunakan untuk mengisi berlawanan dengan lampu utama. Lampu latar atau backlight digunakan untuk mengekstrak dimensi ketiga. Nah, pencahayaan 3 titik adalah tentang menciptakan tampilan 3 dimensi. Dengan menempatkan 3 sumber cahaya pada titik-titik strategis di sekitar subjek, setiap sumber cahaya menerangi dimensi subjek yang terpisah dan menciptakan gambar dengan representasi tinggi, lebar, dan kedalaman yang lebih baik. Nah, pencahayaan 3 titik berhubungan dengan hubungan yang dimiliki setiap cahaya satu sama lain. Nah, ini disebut dengan rasio intensitas cahaya. Umumnya rasio cahaya untuk mengisi adalah cahaya 2:1. Ini berarti lampu utama Anda harus 2 kali lebih terang dari cahaya lampu pengisi Anda. Jadi main light harus 2 kali lebih terang daripada fill light. Nah, hubungan intensitas dan penempatan dapat berubah tergantung pada tujuan Anda. Tetapi rasio di atas akan memberi Anda tampilan yang relatif sinematik untuk pembuatan film naratif. Jika Anda membuat video komersil atau perusahaan, Anda mungkin ingin rasionya 1,5:1, sehingga Anda mendapatkan gambar yang jauh lebih menarik. Jika Anda menggunakan rasio 1:1, gambar Anda mungkin terlalu datar dan tidak memiliki manfaat dimensional. Nah, fungsinya main light sama fill light untuk memberikan dimensi. Jadi kalau 2:1, yang sebelah kanan 2, yang satu sebelah kiri, jadi ada dimensi gelap terangnya. Kalau seandainya 1:1, berarti cahaya datar sama sekali dan flat, artinya flat ya, gitu. Nah, pencahayaan film semuanya didasarkan pada intensitas dan sudut sumber cahaya. Sumber cahaya mengacu pada asal fisik. Sudut cahaya mengacu pada jalur pendekatan. Intensitas cahaya mengacu pada jumlah atau pencerahan. Ini contoh dalam 3-point lighting ya.
Right, let's start with the most obvious thing about 3-point lighting. You're going to need 1, 2, 3 lights to make this work. And they don't have to be the same light. I'm actually using different lights. These are all from Flashpoint, they're all from Adorama, but they're different flashes because we're going to use them in a variety of different ways. The key is 3 points of light in your scene. They're going to hit your background or your model in different ways to create different looks. And the easiest way to explain it is just to get going. So I think we should get a light set. Actually, let's get 3 lights set. Let's get a model in. Let's get shooting. Where's my light stand? To help me out today, I've got the amazing Chloe. Chloe's going to be the model for this photo session, and before we start, it's worth mentioning one thing. There are no set rules when it comes to 3-point lighting, but there are some fairly firm guidelines. And of course, it's all going to start with my camera settings. So I've gone with a shutter speed of 250th of a second. I've got f8 for a reasonable depth of field, and ISO 200, and no flash gives me this, no picture. The one thing you're definitely going to have is a key light. So this is going to be my key light. I've gone for a nice large softbox with a Flashpoint Explore 300 as my light source, and I've placed it a fair distance away from Chloe, at least in my small home studio. This isn't going to be where it stays, but let me show you what we get, just as a starting point. So this is our first light of 3, and from where it is here, it is perfectly okay. There's nothing wrong with this lighting position whatsoever, but
Jadi ini dengan ISO 200 atau ISO 100. Sebenarnya ISO 100 itu kan untuk titik-titik pikselnya itu tidak keluar grainy-nya. Makin ISO tinggi, makin keluar grainy-nya. Nah, kalau ISO 200 itu masih nggak kelihatan. Begitu udah naik ke 800, udah mulai kelihatan grainy-nya kalau dipaksa untuk pencahayaannya. Nah, terus speed-nya 1/250. Kenapa? Karena speed di bawah 125 itu biasanya goyang gitu. Nah, untuk bukan 8, ini dia pengen tajam semuanya. Kalau seandainya 2,8, 1,4 berarti dia fokusnya hanya ke mata saja, sisanya udah ngeblur gitu. Oke.
For the other 3 lights to really be seen in this tutorial and this lighting setup, I'm going to move this light a lot closer. So the light is now quite a lot closer. It's changed my flash power. We were at half power back here. We're now at 1/8 power, which is good news for my flash. And it's good news for the photo as well, because it's going to create a little bit more shadow on Chloe's face. Let's take a test photo. Here we go. And sure enough, we've got shadow on the opposite side of the flash, which is where we're going to see the extra lights. But as another point to note, the background is also just slightly darker, and we'll deal with that in a bit. So for the second light of our
Tadi untuk yang satu lampu saja. Satu lampu saja ini memberikan dimensi yang sebelah kirinya lebih banyak shadow, jadi gelapnya.
darker, and we'll deal with that in a bit. So for the second light of our 3-light setup, I've got a backlight, also known as a hair light, because it is a light that is at the back of Chloe and it's going to light Chloe's hair. So the clue is in the name. But in fact, it's not going to be just Chloe's hair. It's also going to do her neckline, her shoulders, her arms. It's going to put a rim of light that is on the opposite side to our key light, which is why I was so keen to get the shadows in the first place. Now, how bright should that light be? I've gone with 2 stops underneath my key light. So that is metering at f4. You can do it by trial and error and just see what you like. I've also got it in a strip box. You can use any light modifier or no light modifier. As I said at the beginning, there are some firm guidelines, but you can make it your own. Let's test this out, see how it looks. Okay, Chloe, here we go. So this is the result of just that backlight.
Ini backlight atau rim light. Nah, ini yang disebut rim light, dia membentuk shape pada modelnya. Gitu. Jadi ini contoh yang lampu kedua, lampu pertamanya dimatiin dulu.
It puts that little rim of light around Chloe and is doing exactly what it's designed to do, separating her out from the darker background. So if I turn the key light back on and mix the 2 lights together, this is what it looks like. We've got key light on Chloe's face, we've got the backlight on her hair, her shoulders and her neck. All in all, this is working really well.
Nah, ini untuk 2 lampu, yang key light sama backlight. Penggabungan dari key light untuk lampu ke mukanya. Nah, untuk backlightnya membentuk shape di belakang badannya.
Except for that background, which is just a little bit dark and plain. So the third light on my 3-point lighting is going to be this one. Now you might have noticed I've actually used different lights. I've got an Explore 300, I've got an Evolve 200, and this is an Explore 100. You don't have to do this, it just makes life a little bit easier when you're looking at the video description to work out which light is which. So the Evolve 100 is going to be my background light. It's actually got the lightest job to do. It only has to put a bit of light on the background here. But how much light does that want to put out? Well, once again, I've turned the other 2 lights off. I'm not going to meter this one, I'm going to do it by eye. Just see what the background light on its own is doing. Here we go. That is, I think, a little bit on the bright side. So I'm actually going to take it down 2 stops. And if I go from 1/16th power, 1/32nd to 1/64th, and I think that's going to be just enough light, because when I turn on the other lights and combine the 3, it looks like this. Just that nice little halo behind Chloe's shoulders to separate her out. We've still got that hair light and we've still got the key light.
Nah, jadi untuk yang sebelah kiri, 1-point lighting, hanya lampunya hanya ke mukanya saja. Yang sebelah kanan, 3-point lighting, ke muka, terus belakangnya membentuk shape, rim light, terus belakangnya lagi untuk memberikan dimensi antara model sama backgroundnya. Oke. Jadi 3-point lighting itu satunya itu bisa ke background atau satunya lagi bisa ke model. Oke.
Kita absen dulu ya Pak ya.
Absen boleh.
Kakak operator, Kak Irfan boleh hidupin kamera dulu Kak. Kakak operator boleh dipandu ya Kak untuk absensi.
Baik, terima kasih kepada Pak Nanda, Pak Rudi, dan Kites. Kita langsung saja ya dengan sesi foto kedua di sesi kelima ini. Oke, dengan 3, 2, 1. Baik, terima kasih kepada Pak Nanda, Pak Rudi, dan Kites. Silakan dan lanjutkan untuk materi.
Baik, terima kasih.
Terima kasih Kakak operator. Silakan Pak.
Ya, lanjut ya. Nah, kita masuk ke metering. Itu metering ada spot metering, center weight, terus ada partial metering, dan evaluative metering. Nah, Spot metering. Spot metering itu mengukur intensitas cahaya hanya pada area titik fokus dan bagian lain diabaikan, sehingga area fokus akan tetap normal dan bagian lainnya bisa over atau under exposure, seperti foto lilin di dalam ruangan gelap. Nah, kelebihan spot metering merupakan yang paling umum digunakan, sehingga bermanfaat apabila terjadi perbedaan kecerahan yang sangat dominan dan area titik fokus tetap memiliki exposure normal. Kekurangannya, karena hanya diprioritaskan pada satu titik, terkadang menyebabkan area lain menjadi under atau overexpose. Nah, manfaatnya mode ini digunakan apabila ada perbedaan yang mencolok antara objek dengan background, seperti pada saat backlight dan objek yang difoto ingin tetap normal exposure-nya. Lalu ada juga center weight average metering. Nah, center weight ini menitik beratkan pada area tengah atau frame dan mengabaikan bagian pinggirnya atau sisi-sisi frame. Mode ini adalah kombinasi evaluative metering atau partial metering dan partial metering. Nah, kelebihannya lebih memprioritaskan area tengah dan tidak terlalu mengabaikan bagian tepi foto. Kekurangannya kurang bagus untuk objek yang terlalu kecil karena area prioritasnya meliputi hampir keseluruhan bagian tengah frame. Nah, manfaatnya, mode ini digunakan saat foto benda atau manusia dengan perbedaan gelap dan terang yang cukup mencolok pada area lainnya. Ada juga partial metering. Nah, partial metering. Jadi, partial metering ini menitik beratkan pengukuran pencerahan pada area tengah dan frame dengan mengabaikan bagian lain. Kelebihannya memprioritaskan area tengah serta mengabaikan bagian tepi dari gambar, tetapi tidak pada satu titik. Kekurangannya kurang efektif jika objek terlalu kecil karena area prioritas meliputi hampir keseluruhan bagian tengah frame. Singkatnya, objek kecil sementara area prioritas besar. Manfaat mode ini digunakan untuk foto benda atau manusia dengan close up atau makro. Untuk partial meteringnya. Ada juga evaluative metering untuk mengukur seluruh intensitas cahaya pada area foto dan pengukuran area gelap dan terang merata pada keseluruhan frame area foto. Nah, kelebihannya, mode ini paling sering digunakan untuk fotografer pemula. Paling efektif untuk semua objek yang ingin difoto. Dan jarang memberikan pencahayaan yang salah. Kekurangannya tidak maksimal pada objek yang difoto apabila terdapat perbedaan intensitas cahaya yang signifikan antara area satu dengan area lainnya. Manfaat mode ini baik digunakan untuk pencahayaan yang merata, seperti pada pencahayaan rata seperti pada foto landscape atau pemandangan. Jadi, evaluatif ini cocoknya untuk pemandangan atau landscape.
Modes that your camera will use to determine this optimal exposure, and these are evaluative metering, center weighted metering, and spot metering. And there are other variations that different cameras do offer, but we're going to just cover these main three that most cameras have. But first, you'll want to be in manual mode. The light meter is useful when you're doing other modes such as aperture priority, shutter priority, or program mode. However, you almost always want to retain control over all of your settings in video for stylistic reasons, so you'll need to be in manual mode. So, taking a look inside of the viewfinder, you can see the metering scale displayed by a 0 in the middle with bars going left and right to a 1 and 2 on each side of the 0. Each of these numbers represents a stop of light, and the metering scale is typically based on 1/3 increments of these stops of light. So if you point your camera at a very bright area, the bars will go to the plus side, indicating that there is too much light for the current exposure settings. If you point your camera at a very dark area, the bars will go to the minus side, indicating that there's not enough light. So you would then have to change your camera settings in aperture, shutter speed, or ISO accordingly in order to achieve the 0, which is the optimal exposure based on your camera meter. And these camera meters work great when scenes are evenly lit. However, it can become problematic and challenging for your meter to determine the proper exposure when there's various objects with different light levels and intensities in your image. So for example, looking at someone with the sun behind them, there will be very large differences in brightness between your subject and the sun, and your picture will look very different based on if you're exposing for the subject or for the background. And this is where the various types of metering come into play. So evaluative metering is the default mode on most DSLRs, and this is also known as matrix metering or multimetering depending on your camera's manufacturer, but they all work in the same way by dividing the frame up into multiple zones and then analyzing them for light and dark tones. And one of the key factors that your metering system takes into account during evaluative metering is where your focus point is set to. So after looking at all these different zones and figuring out an average among them, your camera looks at where your focus point is set and marks that zone as more important than the rest. So evaluative metering works well with scenes that are evenly lit, and you can typically use it as a go-to method for getting your shots. If you leave your camera in this mode, you'll find out pretty quickly how your exposures will turn out in a variety of settings. Next up is center-weighted metering, and this mode measures the light in the center of your frame with its surroundings and ignores the corners. Compared with evaluative metering, center-weighted metering does not take into account where your focus point is set, but rather only evaluates that middle area of your image. And on many higher-end DSLRs, you can actually change the diameter of your center-weighted area. A good use for this mode would be a scene where you want your primary subject to be correctly exposed while the rest of the image can generally be ignored for proper exposure. And the final mode is spot metering, which will give you the most precise and accurate exposure control over your image because it will only evaluate the light around the point that you choose while ignoring everything else. If you're getting a shot of a person with the sun behind them, but they occupied a small part of the frame, it's best to use the spot metering mode because when your subjects don't take up much of the space, using evaluative or center-weighted metering would most likely result in a silhouette. Another option that some cameras offer to help with determining exposure are zebras, which are hashed lines that show up in any part of your scene that is overexposed. I find this mode very useful when I'm shooting weddings and don't have time to be switching back and forth between all my metering modes. I'll just click on the zebras and then I can see which part of the frame is overexposed to make sure that I'm not overexposing skin. So try out the different types of metering in various settings and see which ones work best for you in different circumstances.
Oke, itu adalah untuk meteringnya. Nah, terus ada juga fokus area. Wide, ini fokus subjek di seluruh monitor. Efektif untuk subjek yang tidak menentu seperti anak-anak, hewan, atau atlet. Ada juga zone. Secara otomatis fokus pada area dalam zona fokus. Pilihan Anda di monitor zona dibagi menjadi 9 area pemfokusan. Sehingga efektif untuk fokus subjek bergerak dalam area spesifik ini. Lalu ada juga center fix, fokus pada subjek yang terpusat pada monitor. Bila digunakan dengan kunci fokus, efektif untuk dibedakan dengan komposisi Anda. Ada juga spot dan expand spot. Memfokuskan pada subjek yang sangat kecil, area sempit dalam bingkai, sehingga Anda dapat bergerak bebas di monitor. Pilih bingkai fokus kecil, sedang, atau besar. Expand spot, perluas area fokus di sekitar titik jika memfokuskan tidak dapat dilakukan pada titik yang Anda pilih. Ada juga tracking. Nah, pengaturan ini hanya tersedia bila mode fokus diatur ke AFC. Bila tombol rana ditekan dan ditahan setengah, produk melacak subjek dengan area fokus otomatis yang dipilih. Fungsi ini tersedia dalam mode pemotretan gambar diam.
Focus mode. Now, there isn't a custom key naturally assigned to focus mode, but you will be able to pick it up in the function menu. Now, I have actually assigned C4 to focus mode on my own camera. Now, focus mode is whether we're just shooting in AFS, single shot AF, or AFC, continuous AF. Now, basically, a single shot is going to be used for subjects that are static and continuous AF for subjects that are moving. There is an automatic AF in between, but I wouldn't really recommend using that. It's supposed to switch between the two, but invariably doesn't. Okay, so that is one reason you may miss your occasional image if the subject is moving. Okay, so function key, there you can see I can quickly move between AFS and AFC if I haven't assigned that to a custom button. Now for focus area, the last couple of Sony E-mount cameras that I've been using, it came out of the box with the C2 button program for focus area. Now I've left it there. You may want to put it to another custom button, but you want to be able to get quick access to this, especially if you're moving between static subjects and moving subjects. It is one of the key areas that I manage to nail focus so often. So if you haven't got it assigned to a custom button because you've overwritten C2, then again you should be able to pick it up in the function menu alongside the focus mode. Now I would certainly, if it's not in the function menu or a custom button, if focus is critical to your workflow, I would consider putting it back in the function menu or assign it to a custom button. Now when I hit the C2 button, I should be able to then navigate my focus areas by using the rear and front dials on the camera. Now if you're going to pick it up from the function menu, just use the multi-selector or joystick just to roll over the focus area. Now once you've done that, you don't need to press the multi-selector in, you just use the front dial to select the top menus and the rear dial to select the sub-menu items. Now if you've pressed the C2 button, you're just going to be going up and down the main menus with the front dial and right and left using the sub-menus using the rear dial. Okay, this is a way of quickly changing focus area in a matter of seconds, and this is something that you will want to do if focus is important to your workflow. On the forums, I often get people saying, what's the best focus area? Well, they're all there for a reason, and you do need to be able to switch when the subject requires that you use a different focus area. So let's take a look at moving to the wide focus area. This is the default of the camera, and if you're using the camera in full auto mode, then it will switch to the wide. It's there for a reason, because wide is very reliable 90% of the time at getting your subject sharp. Now on other camera systems, wide isn't as reliable on the Sony systems, so people coming over from maybe Canon are used to using a spot AF rather than a wide, but wide on the Sony cameras is very reliable. I will trust it to nail this motorcycle moving probably close to 200 kilometers an hour, and I will trust wide to pick it up. Now the motorcycle coming around the bend was obscured, and so the camera had to pick it up exceptionally quickly, and wide was very reliable in this instance. Now wide prioritizes anything that is close to the center of the frame and also close to the camera. Even if the subject isn't direct center, it will still pick it up if it's the closest subject to the camera. And for most instances, this is the most reliable AF area. For instance, if I'm picking up this cyclist, you can see in the image on the top right there, the cyclist isn't in the center of the frame, but it's still close to the camera, and so the algorithms that the Sony system uses is near enough to the center and close to the camera, and it uses a combination of those two factors, and so it will track this cyclist at 8 frames per second in continuous drive mode, and they're all pin sharp. Again, I don't need to reduce the size of the AF area in this instance. One of the things that is also critical to the success of moving subject matter is either your ability to pan the camera if the subject is moving left to right or right to left, or if the subject matter is coming towards the camera, basically be able to freeze it using a fast shutter speed. So I can't increase your technique for panning, but certainly raising the shutter speed should allow you to freeze a subject. Now either use shutter priority mode and use a fast shutter speed such as 2,000th of a second if the subject is moving rapidly, okay, or if the subject is moving quite slowly, you can just slow that down a tad. Okay, so just play with that. If the subject is moving a little bit slower, one of the things that I'll often do is just move the standard ISO auto minimum shutter speed when I'm using aperture priority, and I'll move it from standard to fast, which will effectively double the shutter speed, or faster will double it again. This ensures that if you're working with, say, a 200mm lens in aperture priority, the camera won't trigger the shutter release at 200th of a second, which may not be fast enough to freeze a rapidly moving subject. But if we use the faster setting, it'll now be using 1/800th of a second. Now, obviously, with rapidly moving motorcycles in the previous slide, I am going to raise that and choose a specific ISO auto minimum shutter speed. I have a separate movie on this function because I actually prefer using aperture priority to shutter priority even when shooting sports action. So let's take a look at some more examples of just using the wide focus area in conjunction with AFC. As you can see, the subject isn't direct center, but it's always going to pick the dog in this instance. And so I can shoot a burst of 20, 30, 40 images, and the camera will reliably track this subject. Okay, this was actually shot on an RX100 compact that has the same AF areas or focus areas, and again, just using wide, it will always choose the volleyball player in the foreground because not only is she more center, but she's actually closer to the camera. Now, we may need to change the focus settings if we want to focus on the character behind the character in the foreground. Even when a subject is quite a long way off center, so long as it's still closest to the camera will always try and focus on the bird and never try and pick focus in the sky. Okay, so this is one of the great advantages when tracking something that is moving very rapidly. We don't have to keep a small focus area on a subject that is moving so quickly we can't reliably keep a small focus area on.
Jadi untuk yang benda bergerak bisa untuk area fokusnya yang wide dan modenya AFC. AFC itu autofocus continue. Nah, fokusnya itu akan mengikuti objeknya dan dia akan ambil objek yang terdekat dengan kamera lensanya.
The bird. To give you an example of why some DSLR owners fail in this instance is their wide focus area isn't very wide at all, and also the camera manufacturers recognize that choosing the wide focus area or auto selecting a focus point is not as reliable as you choosing a specific focus point. Now, this isn't the case for the Sony cameras. Wide is your friend, which is why it's the default. In this instance, you can see, even though I haven't managed to keep the bird in the center, just my broad spread of focus points, these are all PDAF points, 693 of them on an A7 III or A9 camera, and the camera will pick that subject up and very reliably. Take a look again, press the C2 button or pick up the focus area in the function menu. You can do this with the camera at your eye. You don't need to lower the camera to press the function button. You will get the same view not only on the back of the camera but also in the EVF. And so if I'm shooting sports action, I generally never lower the camera to change my settings. So this is basically where me just pressing C2 and rolling that front dial, I can come out of wide into zone. And the reason I might want to come into zone is if I'm shooting through subjects that are close to the camera and I don't want the camera to pick up one of those foreground subjects. You can see on the extreme left there is somebody's shoulder I'm shooting over. Now, in this instance, wide would probably still focus on my main character, but if in doubt, okay, I will reduce the focus area. Now, this zone can be moved. There are 9 possible positions of this zone, and I can quickly move this zone using the multi-selector or joystick, just to make sure that I can always pick up this subject reliably. Now again, the same principles will result. The camera will again choose front and center, but this time ignore everything outside of the zone. So it's basically working on the same algorithms as wide, but just over a smaller focus area. Okay, let's move down to a much smaller. Now we've got flexible spots. That lower row can be selected using the rear dial, but we've also got to the right an expand flexible spot. So your choice whether to go with a specific spot size or the expand flexible spot. Now in this instance I've gone for a smaller AF point because I need to avoid picking up the hand, which is closer than the compact camera that this guy is using. Now the instances where I need to come down to such a small focus area are probably less than 5%. I have noticed a lot of photographers shoot most of their stuff using a spot, but I use the larger focus areas most of the time. So let's take a look at where a spot focus would be unreliable. Now a small spot focus area needs an edge of contrast in order to be able to snap focus quickly. If the camera can't pick it up with a PDAF point, it will start using a contrast detect autofocus point.
Jadi ini untuk yang spot itu fokusnya lebih kecil ya, jadi bisa untuk lebih fleksibel diarahkan ke mana-mana. Dan sekitar-sekitarnya bisa langsung ngeblur. Itulah fungsinya untuk spot. Ya. Nah, ini area fokus yang berdasarkan subjek di layar. Untuk spot, subjek harus cukup besar untuk mencakup seluruh area fokus. Sebagai pedoman, memiliki subjek pada ukuran ini menghindari fokus melayang ke latar belakang. Untuk expand spot, area fokus termasuk area yang diperluas harus tumpang tindih dengan subjek sebagai pedomannya. Ukuran area fokus optimal untuk adegan skating sama bergantung pada ukuran subjek di layar. Spot M direkomendasikan untuk fokus pada wajah subjek skater. Jika diatur ke zone, fitur lain seperti tanda garis di arena skating akan berada di dalam area fokus tersebut. Dan kamera mungkin fokus pada fitur tersebut, bukan pada skaternya. Untuk menargetkan subjek yang bergerak cepat pada ukuran ini menggunakan panjang fokus yang panjang. Cobalah pengaturan lebih lebar seperti zone. Pilih area fokus berdasarkan pergerakan subjek. Jika subjek bergerak lambat atau dapat diprediksi, gunakan pengaturan area kecil seperti expand spot. Jadi expand spot itu untuk foto benda atau apa itu sangat bagus sekali karena itu bisa diprediksi tempatnya di mana. Gitu. Ini fokusnya bisa akurat dan sesuai dengan targetnya. Nah, sebaliknya jika subjeknya bergerak kemana-mana ke kiri, ke kanan, atas, bawah, dengan kecepatan tinggi dan tidak dapat diprediksi, gunakan area fokus yang lebih luas seperti wide untuk mempertahankan fokus sambil penyesuaian komposisi. Jadi kalau misalnya untuk yang bergerak, skating apa segala, langsung bisa gunakan wide. Kalau untuk produk yang tidak bergerak dan kita bisa tentukan arahnya mau kemana, itu bisa gunakan yang expand spot atau spot. Nah, ini grafiknya. Kalau subjeknya face, bisa gunakan yang wide, terus untuk L pakai yang zone. Nah, terus sebelah kiri subjek predictable. Nah, subjeknya predictable bisa pakai expand spot. Predictable tuh bisa tebak subjek yang mau kemana. Pakai yang spot, yang titik doang, gitu. Nah, terus kalau yang slow, itu bisa pakai spot S atau spot L. Nah, ada juga yang unpredictable. Nah, unpredictable ini pakai zone sama wide, gitu.
So before getting into metering modes, we need to understand what a light meter is in your camera and how it works. The job of the light meter is to measure the amount of reflected light in the scene to decide whether or not your photos need to be brighter or darker. To note, light meters are worried about brightness, not color, so you can translate all of this to working in black and white. When shooting in manual, the light meter only shows what the exposure looks like to the camera without changing any settings. In any automatic modes, the camera uses the light meter to decide whether or not the image needs to be brighter or darker and changes either the shutter speed, aperture, or ISO to change the exposure of the photo. Camera manufacturers have decided on an ideal brightness for your photos, and that's what's called medium gray or 18% gray. That is a gray that reflects 18% of light. If your scene is darker than medium gray, the camera will brighten the exposure until it hits that medium gray level. If your exposure is brighter than medium gray, it will darken your exposure to again hit that medium gray level. I can show you this by taking two exposures, one of something in my office here that's white, and another of something that's in black, using aperture priority that allows the camera to change the exposure to make sure it's appropriate. The white subject, and realize it's too bright, will try to darken it to medium gray. On the other hand, when the camera looks at a very dark subject, almost black, it will lighten the exposure. If I compare the two exposures on the screen at the same time, you'll see they come out at the same medium gray exposure. Different metering modes exist because the camera is asking you, the operator, which part of the scene do you want me to measure the light from before deciding on the exposure? The whole scene, just the center, the subject, the parts in focus. That's what metering modes are all about. Right before we get into metering modes, let's look at the light meter. The light meter is a representation of the camera's view of the exposure of the photo. 0 is this 18% or a medium gray, and you can see the scale goes up and down. To the right is +1, +2, and +3 stops of light, and on the left-hand side is -1, -2, and -3 stops of light as the image gets darker. So now that we understand the basics of metering and how the light meter scale works, let's look at different metering modes. Now, different brands will use different names for some of these, but most brands share very similar metering styles. So number one, most cameras have a matrix or evaluative mode. This is often the default on most cameras. It looks at the whole scene, but tries to decide what might be the subject, what parts are in focus, and uses analytics to try to establish what might be the best exposure given the whole scene. But if you have more complex scenarios than this mode may not work well for you. Let's look at some of the others. The next mode is center weighted. It means the camera is paying more attention to what's in the center of the image than what's on the edges. That makes a lot of sense because often your subject will be in the center of the frame. In this setting, overly bright or dark areas on the edges of the frame may be ignored. The next mode is partial metering. Partial metering does not use the whole frame, but uses a small center section, maybe 10% of the frame, to decide what the exposure is. This may be accompanied by a circle around the area that's being considered by the camera to decide the exposure.
Ya, itulah untuk yang meteringnya. Oke. Nah, menggunakan elemen visual untuk menyampaikan ide dan emosi. Penggunaan warna, eksploitasi garis dan bentuk, tekstur, dan detail pencahayaan yang dipertimbangkan.
How to speak in visual language. Most of us take pictures because we intuitively want to create. It is how we can express our thoughts and feelings about things. We can communicate how we see and feel about the world. For me, communicating through impressionist photography is challenging but exciting. The diversity of techniques and approaches allows me to express a rich array of moods and emotions. There is immense freedom to work with precision and control, or to try a spontaneous, experimental approach. I feel like I can fully express myself through impressionist photography. The success in your photography depends on you, your eye, your knowledge, and your ideas. The challenge is how to translate your ideas into an image successfully. How do you make yourself heard through your images? How do you start communicating through your pictures? Begin by ensuring that you speak in visual language. Since you are the one initiating the conversation, you have a responsibility to your viewers to use the visual language well. The more extensive your vocabulary is, the more expressive and creative you can communicate what you want to say. So, what is visual language? What are the words you can use in your images? Just as in verbal communication, visual communication requires a language or vocabulary that connects the artist with the viewers. What is expressed in language through words, in visual communication may be expressed through the choice of light, lines, and color. Each of these elements has a unique way of expressing feelings and emotions. To be truly effective, you need to be clear about your message and make sure the use of the light, lines, shapes, and color in your images are consistent with that message. Understanding how light works is essential for communicating your idea. Light gives depth, dimension, and life to your image. Lines give structure and also can be used to guide the viewer's eye through the image. Color influences the way ideas are presented and the mood of a photograph. Color can also direct the eye by emphasizing different parts of the image. To speak the visual language well, you need as much knowledge as possible about line, lines, and color, and how they can be used effectively. You need to develop a patience that it takes to express your subjects. This means looking deeply at these subjects. Every photograph also needs a good composition or arrangements of elements. A poor composition will stop your idea from having the desired effect. The image may end up confusing to the viewer. When photographing, you can easily get overwhelmed by the amount of information in front of you. While all the information may be intriguing, it won't necessarily contribute to a good image. So it is essential, especially when it comes to impressionist photography, to learn to see and simplify the subject so you can effectively translate them into your images. The physical characteristic of your subject should give you composition and choice of a technique. Everything you include in your image, it's a choice. All elements can help you tell a story or express ideas.
Jadi semua foto itu bisa memberikan cerita dan memberikan ide-ide untuk audiens yang melihatnya. Oke. Penerapan teknik kamera dalam fotografi, fotografi aksi. Fotografi aksi cukup menantang apabila kita harus menangkap momen-momen secara spesial, cepat, dan tepat. Nah, memahami subjek yang tepat teman-teman potret, jika teman-teman dapat memasukkan pola tersebut, teman-teman dapat siap mengabadikan momen bahkan sebelum itu terjadi. Ini yang tadi ya, untuk AFC atau fokus continue ya. Jadi untuk sport, ini settingannya AFC, jadi dia akan mengikuti objek yang akan difoto. AFC walaupun bukaannya 2,8 ini subjeknya tetap fokus, yang di belakang backgroundnya ngeblur. Nah terus untuk speednya 1/2500, jadi sangat besar sekali ya. Ini dengan menggunakan ISO 4000. Kenapa? Karena cahayanya kurang ini gitu. Nah, untuk mendapatkan speed yang tinggi agar dia freeze, diam, jadi asanya dinaikin gitu. Ini ya, jadi dapat ya. Nah, dia tetap sensornya tetap ngikutin objeknya walaupun bergerak ke arah depan kamera. Jadi dia nggak miss ke objek-objek yang lainnya. Nah, contohnya buat fotografi sport ya. Ini contohnya. Nah, teknik fotografi freezing. Shutter speed adalah kecepatan bukan ranah yang dapat mempengaruhi pencahayaan yang sempurna, mengontrol blur, dan membuat efek yang menarik. Freezing motion adalah teknik motret dengan cara bukan menghentikan objek yang sedang bergerak, mulai dari pelan hingga dengan sangat cepat. Nah, motret objek tidak bergerak berbeda dengan motret objek yang bergerak, namun berhenti. Contoh subjek yang tidak bergerak adalah benda mati. Teknik ini umumnya digunakan pada saat pengambilan gambar ketika sedang orang berolahraga. Nah, ada juga untuk motret orang yang sedang melempar sesuatu, jatuh, air, atau kendaraan yang sedang melaju, dan lain.
And then we're going to backlit the scene. So that's the idea. So I'm going to get my flash and I'm going to put it onto manual mode and we're going to put it down into 1/8 power. Why 1/8 power? Well, you've got to start somewhere and that seems like a good place to begin. Chances are we'll need to change it, but for now we'll pop it down at 1/8. For the camera, I'm going to work in M for manual. I'm going to be on a 200th of a second shutter speed. I'll choose f8 as my aperture and I'm going to start at ISO 200. I may end up changing that, but that's again a good place to begin. I'm on a tripod because, well, I'm not going to be able to press the button, drop the lemon and do everything whilst I'm behind the camera, so a tripod is really important for this shoot, as is a little remote release just to trigger everything. Now there's one more thing I need to do. My speed light is already set so it's in its slave mode, but the actual camera itself, I need to pop up the little flash to trigger the main flash, and that's going to act as a master, and then the speed light as a slave. Finally, there's one more piece of equipment that I always have in the studio, but whenever I'm photographing water, it's absolutely vital. That's a really good towel. You're going to need this. It's going to get wet. So I've got my glass here. This is the thing we're going to drop the lemon into, and I'm going to fill it with water. But just to put a little bit more interest inside the glass, I've got some of these. And these are ice cubes, but it's winter. I don't want to hold real ice cubes. It's freezing enough as it is. So these are actually fake. These are made out of glass. So you can pick up glass or Perspex ice cubes, or of course you can use real ones if you like. So let's just add those carefully inside. So once you've got your shot framed up, here's a really good tip. Make sure your glass is in focus and then switch from autofocus to manual focus. That way, when you're taking pictures and you're away from the camera, you won't have to worry about it suddenly refocusing and missing a great shot. Okay, so let's take a test picture. In fact, let's take one without the flash, just to show you why it's so important. If the flash doesn't fire, then I really don't have a picture. It's almost totally black. No flash, no picture. With the flash going, well, let's take a test picture and see how we go. That white background is not quite as white as I'd like it to be. Now remember, I'm on 1/8 power for the flash, so I've got a little bit of wiggle room here. Let's go and increase the flash power. So I'm going to dial it up from 1/8 to 1/4 power. So that's one more stop of light. That's going to make things brighter. That may well be just the right solution. Let's take the same shot again. Here we go. Yeah, that's better. I've definitely got more white. Yeah, I'm losing a little bit still. There's a bit of grey on the background. Now, I don't want to go any more on the flash than 1/4 power because the freezing power of the flash, the reason water comes out frozen and sharp is because the flash only lasts for a very short period of time. At 1/4 power, the duration is about a 4,000th of a second. If I increase the flash power, then effectively I change the shutter speed and I would end up with water that's not quite as sharp. So I don't want to go any more than 1/4 power, but I can still change the ISO. I'm on 200 ISO at the moment. Okay, well, let's just pop it up to 400 ISO and we'll see how that changes the shot. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so 400 ISO, 1/4 power on the flash, f8, we're ready to go. So I'm ready to start taking pictures. I've got my lemon now sliced up and water's ready. I know the camera's set. So all I need to do is drop this perfectly into the water and press the button at the exact moment when it creates a perfect splash. Yeah, this isn't going to happen in one shot, is it? This is going to take a few goes, but here we go. We'll line things up. I'll try and remember to get high enough so my hand's not in the frame. And splash. Okay, well, how did that go? Well, that's not too bad. That's a pretty good splash, but there's probably a better one in here somewhere. So let's get my lemon back and we'll top up the water. Here we go. And we'll go again. And this really is a numbers game. The more you do this, the more chance of getting a good splash. Yeah, you just got to get the timing right. So let's top that up once more. Get the lemon and we'll drop it in. Excellent. Okay, so I've got a really good shot there. Now, if you don't get it after a couple of goes, you're going to need just to wipe down your surface here and, well, try again. But remember, if you do wipe down your surface, if you move your camera or your glass of water, you've got to refocus. Remember, you're on manual focus, so if anything changes, that could cause you problems. And you don't want to miss a shot because it's out of focus. Let's just do one more. Here we go. Wow, big splash. Fantastic. Now, once you've got a really good shot that you're happy with, the temptation is to stop. You've got the picture, well done. But maybe try a couple of other ideas and try going closer. So I'm going to reframe, go closer, and just take loads more pictures.
Oke, tadi untuk yang freeze cipratan air ya. Contohnya seperti ini. Ini untuk buat minuman hibiki. Tapi tadi kan yang dicipratkan, tadi yang dilempar tuh jeruk. Kalau ini kita lemparnya es batu. Jadi kelihatan splash-nya tuh lebih besar gitu. Ini salah satu contoh freeze ya. Tapi ini untuk yang Pepsi. Oke. Nah, ada juga fotografi landscape. Fotografi yang umum dalam dunia fotografi yang menunjuk pada menangkap pemandangan alam dengan sudut pandang yang luas. Kebanyakan menggunakan lensa yang besar ya. Lensa yang wide. Contohnya seperti ini.
Ambassador. I'd like to run you through the camera settings I use when shooting landscapes. Now I'll be using an A7R III for the purposes of this demonstration, but you will find these camera settings on other Alpha cameras. Now typically I'll be setting the camera up for use with a wide angle lens. Now I'm either using a prime such as this 2.8 18mm Batis lens, or I'll be using one of Sony's FE1635 zooms, either the f4 Zeiss or the 2.8 GM. Okay, so the sort of settings I'll be using are very reliable, and what I'll be doing is I'll be creating a preset for that, so you can dial them in simply one turn of the shooting mode dial. So let's get started. Now many people when shooting landscapes will shoot in aperture priority, but I will typically be moving that dial around to manual because I like to be in complete control. Now we are going to deep dive into the menus, and we're starting at the very first menu there. Just keep an eye on the bottom of this window here. You can see as I navigate through the position that I am in the menus, and this will help you follow along on your own Alpha camera. Now I'm using the file format RAW, and I'll also be using the uncompressed. Now this isn't available on the APS-C sensors, but on the full frame such as the A7R2, A7R3, A9, etc. you will find this uncompressed. This gives us the maximum amount of latitude for post-processing the files. Okay, so typically moving forward a tab, I will switch the long exposure noise reduction off. This is applied to RAW files as well as JPEGs. Now if you're shooting with 30-second exposures, that noise reduction in camera is going to lock you out of taking another shot for another 30 seconds. So I typically prefer to do the noise reduction in post-processing. If you would prefer the camera to do that noise reduction, then by all means switch that noise reduction on in camera. Now color space, it's typically really only makes a difference with JPEGs, so it doesn't really matter if you're working with sRGB or Adobe RGB. If you occasionally work with JPEGs, then I would advise for landscapes with rich colors to move that over to Adobe RGB. Now lens compensation. Now this is an important part of what we do, is we can optimize the image for any lens aberrations such as chromatic distortion or shading. Now this is possible to do this in post-production, and so if you switch these options to auto, you don't need to do them in a program such as Lightroom. So you don't want to be doing these lens corrections twice. For instance, especially with the lens shading, you're going to find that the corners are getting lighter rather than being corrected. Okay, so I typically use a remote release or an intervalometer when I'm shooting landscapes. Now, if you don't own one of these, I would actually, and also obviously a tripod. Now, sometimes the tripods I'm using, they can be very small. I have tripods that are small enough to fit in a messenger bag. Now, typically when I am shooting landscapes, I am very low to the ground. This is a way of getting more of the foreground into the image. So I do carry larger tripods when needs arise, but I'll often always be carrying one of these very small tripods. Now, if you are working with the drive mode set to single shooting, okay, that is fine for working with these remote releases, but if you don't own a remote release, then what I would advise is go into the drive mode and set that to self timer 2 seconds. This allows you to press the shutter release, take your hand away from the camera, let the camera vibration settle, and then the camera takes that shot. You can extend that to 5 seconds if required. Okay, now with these full frame sensors, I typically very rarely, if ever, bracket these days. But if you do need to bracket, especially working with APS-C sensors, then it is possible to set up the bracket self timer. This is another way of delaying 3 shots in continuous mode for those to be composited later in post-production software. Okay, now with the A7R III we do have a new feature. It's called Pixel Shift Multi-Shooting. Now this will require additional post-processing, so if you're not prepared to go that extra mile in post-processing, just make sure that is switched to off. Now if you are prepared to work with Pixel Shift Multi-Shooting, you are going to get extra dynamic range, less moire, and also extra detail in your shots. So although the post-processing can be time consuming, you do get benefit from doing this on the A7R III. Now I have created a tutorial, an editing tutorial, to show you my typical editing workflow when I do use Pixel Shift Multi-Shooting. Now, if we move forward to the third tab, you'll see that there is a memory. Now, it's too early to assign the settings that we've already set up to the memory because we need to set up some additional settings, but we will be coming back to this tab when we've set up all of the settings for landscape shooting. Now, the focus mode, I will typically work with manual focus. This is a very good reason for this. It's actually very easy for me to get the depth of field I need when using manual focus. It's actually faster than using autofocus. Now I'm just taking you over to a website which has a depth of field calculator. It's the Cambridge and Colour website, and it's showing that if I'm using an aperture of f/16, then on my 18mm Batis, then I'm going to get a depth of field from 1 meter to infinity by setting the focus distance to 5 meters. Now the camera and also the Batis lens will give you a readout when you hit that 5 meter focal distance, and so that is a very easy way of setting this focus. Occasionally, if the priority in the landscape is in the distance, I might move that out to 6 meters. But I'll certainly move that back to 5 meters, especially working with a 16mm, okay, or where the foreground is the hero in the element. Okay, if you want to maybe even shoot slightly wider to get the maximum sharpness from your lens, which can be achieved at apertures such as f11, then you may want to look at another movie I've created, which is Quick and Easy Techniques to Find the Hyperfocal Distance. This is actually quite easy on a mirrorless camera to do this. Okay, so let's go back to the menu settings here. Now, if you ever do need to drop into autofocus, the focus area I would be recommending is Expand Flexible Spot. Okay, now moving forward again onto the 9th tab, ISO, I'm going to set that to 100. There are some lower ISOs on the full frame cameras than 100 ISO. 100 ISO is the default or optimum ISO. Now with some camera systems, if you go lower than 100 ISO, you can compromise your dynamic range, the ability for the camera to record detail in shadows and highlights. But on the A7R II and A7R III, actually you don't lose any dynamic range by maybe choosing 50 ISO. Having said that, I will basically set this up for 100 ISO now. Okay, metering mode. This really doesn't make that much difference, to be honest. I'm going to be reviewing an image and adjusting the exposure as I go, but typically I'll have the metering mode set to multi. White balance, again, this is really only applicable to JPEGs. If you notice the white balance is well out when you're taking your shots, you can always move or correct that white balance to create a custom white balance in camera. But remember, you can do this in post-production, so you don't need to worry too much about the color that isn't precisely accurate in camera. Okay, dynamic range optimizer. Now this is a setting that is applied to JPEG only. It's not applied to the RAW, but we can alter the preview in camera, and it can make the seeing into the shadows so much easier when we're shooting high contrast landscapes. Typically, if I've got a very high contrast scene and the foreground is very dark, I'm going to switch that dynamic range optimizer to LV5. This is going to significantly brighten the dark shadows, and this may help me see into those shadows to work out a focus point that I'm trying to achieve. Another setting that is also only applied to JPEGs is the creative style. Now, but this is another reason that I may want to go into this, is because again it alters the preview. It also alters the review of our images. Okay, and I'll look at the next slide or two to show you that. Now typically what I'll do is, in order to get an accurate histogram on the back of the camera, I'll often lower the contrast in the creative style, maybe dialing that back as much as -3, which is the maximum minus setting on that. Just to show you what this does when you're reviewing your image, just hit the review when you've taken an image, and then hit the display button on the top of that dial. Now you'll see the histograms, okay, the red, green, blue and luminosity histograms, and if you see areas of the file blinking, that is warning you of overexposure. But that overexposure is tends to come in a little bit early because the camera thinks you're recording JPEGs. So the histograms are really optimized for the JPEGs, not the raw files. So by lowering the contrast setting in your creative style, you can lower the blink is basically what they're called. The blink is coming in warning you of overexposure, when in real fact that you're not really overexposing those highlights. And the optimum exposure for landscapes is the highest one that you can do before overexposing those highlights. Okay, so moving forward onto the 13th tab, we've got focus magnifier time. Now if you want to take your time achieving that focus, I would set that to no limit, so that gives you plenty of time then to move in and review those foreground objects that you're trying to achieve focus in. Okay, now one of the things that I'll often be working with, especially in seascapes, is I'll be working with an ND filter. Now I'll work with two ND filters on my Batis. I'll have an ND 200, which is 7 2/3 of a stop, and I'll also work with an ND 8, which is 3 stops. And on the Batis I can actually combine both filters without clipping the corners of the file, and I can get more than 10 stops of reduced light. What this does is it allows me to slow down the exposure. So typically if we're working in sunlight, even though we've lowered the ISO to 100 and closed the aperture down to f16, I might only be able to achieve a 50th of a second, and that's not enough to smooth or make waters tranquil. Okay, so as soon as I pop that ND filter on, I am able to push that exposure time out to 10 seconds or more, right up to 30 seconds. I typically don't go over 30 seconds unless it's very important to me, because we are going to lower the bit depth from 14 to 12 when we go into bulb mode. Okay, so I'm working with a 10-second exposure here, which is again smoothing those busy waters out. Now you will find that if you're trying to use your magnify focus with an ND filter on, you may have trouble seeing in those shadows even with a dynamic range optimizer on. So you may want to whip that ND filter off to get the focus and then put that back on.
Jadi untuk yang ngambil bentuk ininya air-airnya menjadi seperti awan-awan ini, dia pakai 10 second dengan bukaannya f-nya 16 pakai ASA 100. Pada aslinya sebenarnya ini cahayanya gelap banget, tapi ditampilkan dengan f16 untuk dapat fokus tajam semuanya, dan speednya pakai slow speed.
So you may want to whip that ND filter off to get the focus and then put that back on. Okay, steady shot. Typically if you're working with an ultra wide angle lens with a short duration shutter speed, leaving the steady shot on doesn't really compromise the file that much, but with very long exposures and with telephoto lenses, steady shot will work against you when the camera is on a tripod. So if you are looking for optimum sharpness, I would switch that steady shot off. If I just go back to that steady shot, just notice that that is in the second camera panel there. So we've come away from that first one, and one of the only settings we're picking up from that camera panel, the second camera panel on the fourth tab, is that steady shot feature. As soon as we've set that, then we're ready to come back to that first camera panel and come down to number 3, back to our memory, and this allows us to register all of these settings. Okay, once we go enter into that, we will typically enter in 1, 2, or 3. I'm going to enter all of my settings in number 1 now, and as soon as I press the button in the center here, I'm going to register that. Okay, so once it's registered, as soon as I want to recall all of those settings, like I've been shooting something else completely different to landscapes, if I just want to recall all of those settings I've just set in, all I need to do is turn the shooting mode dial around to number 1. Okay, so a couple of other things that I might do just to make the shooting experience for landscapes just a lot easier, especially if you're working in dark environments and you really want these settings at your fingertips. And setting the down button, which doesn't have assigned to it any sort of function or custom operation, I'm going to set that up with my focus magnifier, so I don't have to go hunting through the menus looking to zoom in when I'm in manual focus. You can set that up to another custom button, but I'm just setting up to the down button just because that doesn't yet have anything assigned to it. Okay, so next I'm going to come over to the function menu. Now the function menu set allows me to apply some commonly used settings and put them into the function menu, so I don't have to remember which tabs they're in. A couple of the ones that I might assign to the function menu is that pixel shift multi-shooting, so that I don't have to remember which panel it is in the menus. Another one that I might assign is to go in and switch the steady shot off and on, because typically as soon as that camera comes off the tripod, I do want to remember to put the steady shot back on for any handheld low light work that I'm working with. So just remember, you can add more of your favorite settings to that FN menu or function menu, and that is highly advisable. Okay, and those are my 2 favorites for landscape.
Oke, berikut untuk contoh landscape yang diambil dari dia. Untuk bukanya 16, 10 second, dan pakai AC-nya 100 ya. Gitu. Kalau seandainya cahayanya masih terlalu terang, bisa gunakan ND filter. Oke. Nah, untuk fotografi malam adalah genre fotografi landscape yang menarik. Nah, teman-teman berdiri di luar dalam kegelapan total, tetapi tampilan kamera menunjukkan sesuatu yang lain. Langit berbintang dan keindahan yang di sekitar Anda. Contohnya ini seperti fotografi malam. Ini juga lagi acara tahun baruan.
Flash. Direct flashes are terrible. Hardly anyone ever looks flattering with direct flash. It creates this deer in the headlights look.
Now, just to specify, I am talking about the built-in flash on your camera. Off-camera flashes and flashes that are separate attachments are omitted from this mistake.
You see, what happens is if you're shooting an auto with your camera and the camera detects that it's in the dark, it will automatically pop up that flash. And sometimes it's super funny watching people try to shoot into the dark sky and their flash goes off. It literally does nothing except ruining other people's time lapses. Curse you, Karen!
Yes, believe it or not, I've had random flashes pop up in my time lapses before due to beginners not knowing how to work their cameras. But that's okay. I'm here to point you in the right direction. Quite literally. If you're going to be using a flash and it's possible to aim your flash up, like mine, you can use the ceiling to bounce the light and create a more flattering image of your subject. Now, if there are no ceilings for you to bounce the light, you can try diffusing your flash with a napkin.
So I have this napkin that I stole from Starbucks earlier. I'm gonna drape this over the flash and we're gonna see what happens. We're gonna take one without the napkin, and we'll take one with the napkin. 1, 2, and 3. All right, now we'll take one with the napkin.
Ini kalau fotografi malam yang menggunakan direct flash.
My lens is so big that the flash is literally casting the shadow of the lens on you. So this illustrates my point somewhat pretty well because as you can see, the flash casted a pretty harsh shadow because of the lens, and that's so big. So the shadow on you, it looks really harsh, but when I soften it,
That looks good.
that shadow is not as harsh. So that still kind of proves my point.
I like that one.
Boom, easy.
By the way, if you want to take better low light photos without ever using your on-camera flash at all, queue up my next video on low light photography without flash.
Mistake number 2, shooting at a shutter speed that is way too fast. Now this is a super easy mistake to make, and my $4,000 professional camera here likes to make that mistake when it's on auto. Now I don't mean to offend anybody who's shooting auto with these types of cameras. Auto generally does work pretty well when there's a lot of lights, but when it's in a low light situation like where we are at right now, it prioritizes sharp and steady photos. So what it does is that it raises the shutter speed higher than necessary.
So what do I mean by too fast of a shutter speed? When you run your shutter speed dial to the right, you're raising your shutter speed. This is great for freezing action, but also lessen the amount of light coming in. For example, if your shutter speed is at 1/125 and you're moving it to 1/250 or 1/500 or 1/8000, then that's raising the speed of your shutter. Vice versa, if you start at 1/125 but you move down to 1/50, 1/5, 1 second, 15 second, 30 second, then that's slowing down your shutter speed, allowing in more light. To make sure you're maximizing the amount of light coming in, I recommend moving over to manual mode. If you're a full frame user, set your shutter speed to match the focal length you're shooting in. Since I'm shooting with a 40mm here, my shutter speed will be at 1/40th of a second. If you're an APS-C or crop sensor shooter, you will want your shutter speed to double your focal length. For example, if you're also using a 40mm, you will need to shoot at shutter speed 1/80. As for aperture value, I would set it to f3.5. If you can go even lower than that, like f2.8, f1.8, or even f1.4, that would be great. But if you notice you're missing focus quite a bit, then go back up the other way. For ISO, I'd recommend keeping below 6400 if you're a full frame user and 3200 if you're an APS-C user. Now, these are just my recommended settings for beginners. Once you understand how each settings work, you can start bending the rules yourself. For example, shooting at an even slower shutter speed for some interesting results, and still be able to get some pretty sharp photos.
So don't be afraid to slow your shutter speed down to 1/15 or 1/10. You can still get some pretty decent low light results if you have a camera or a lens with some sort of stabilization built in. And not only that, when you slow down your shutter speed, you can get some pretty cool motion effect in your photos.
By the way, this is situation dependent. If you do slow your shutter speed down drastically, any motion that happens during your shot will be blurred. So if that's not your intended purpose, make sure you raise that shutter speed to freeze the action. Moving on, I don't ever recommend photographing in a super dimly lit area. It is just impossible, and usually the photos don't come out that great. But there are some exceptions, like this digital arts museum that we were in. No matter how good a camera is, it can still have trouble finding your subject in the dark. So mistake number 3, letting your camera hunt focus.
Now, if your camera is having trouble finding focus in the dark, don't be afraid to use manual focus. It's going to save you a lot of time trying to manual focus your subject in the dark rather than letting the camera focus hunt in the dark room.
If you're a mirrorless camera user, you are in luck. You will likely have a feature called focus peaking. When you enable that, little dots will appear on the back of your camera screen, letting you know that your subject is in focus. The more dots you have, the more accurate your focus is. To learn more about using focus peaking when manually adjusting the focus of your shot, refer to my video right up here. Moving on to mistake number 4.
Now, I do want to caution you when you're filming with really bright lights in a dark area, make sure you do not blow out the highlights. Something like this is easily could be overblown in your photos and it won't look that great. So make sure you keep the highlights below the clipping level. So you may be asking, what is below the clipping level? Your camera might have something called a histogram. If the graph leans way towards one side of the graph. That means you're either clipping the black levels or the white levels. So try to keep that graph in the center of that rectangle for the best exposure for your shots.
For cityscape shots especially, it is super easy to blow out the neon signs and the available lighting. So my best tip for you is to expose for the highlight. If your camera does not have that histogram thing that I was talking about, set it to what looks right to your eyes.
Mistake number 5, not doing any sort of editing to your photo. The only way to make your photo pop is by doing some editing. I know it sounds scary, but no matter how correct your settings are, your photo is gonna look a little bit bland. So take it to Lightroom CC, take it to Capture One Pro, whatever editing software, mess around with some of the settings to make your photo pop.
Gitu ya untuk yang foto malam dengan suasana yang skylight gitu. Oke. Nah, menangkap ekspresi emosional. Nah, fotografer potret yang kuat membutuhkan hubungan yang baik antara fotografer dengan subjeknya. Penting untuk fotografer memahami latar belakang, kepribadian, dan emosi subjek sebelum sesi pemotretan. Menangkap ekspresi emosional yang kuat memerlukan perhatian terhadap detail kecil seperti mata, mulut, dan postur tubuh subjek. Peralatan fotografi yang tepat juga memainkan peran penting dalam menangkap ekspresi emosional yang baik. Nah, pemilihan momen yang tepat untuk menangkap ekspresi emosional adalah kunci kesuksesan dalam fotografi potret. Ini salah satu fotografi potret. Nah, ini pakai high key ya. Jadi backgroundnya putih semua. Terus kita di sampingnya ada rim light juga, dan di atasnya juga ada lampu hairlight. Nah, lampu hairlight ini memberikan efek untuk rambutnya tidak terlalu hitam, tapi ada bayangan warna putihnya. Gitu. Oke. Nah, ini juga kita pakai high key dengan background putih.
Using 2 lights, or maybe even 1 light, but a maximum of 2. And we're going to stick with basic modifiers, softboxes, P70 reflectors, grids, and a few homemade accessories. Many of you are familiar with the lovely Karis because you've done lots of modeling for us, haven't you? She stood in the sea in stormy gales, laid down in ice-cold ponds, had a dagger in your hand. You've done loads of stuff with us, so nice to be working with Karis again today. I've got an octabox. It's called an octabox for obvious reason. Nice big light means good, soft lighting. So at the moment, we've got a white studio with a white wall, a simple chair. So I'm just going to take this shot. I'm shooting with a 100mm lens, which is equivalent to about 75, 80mm and 35mm format. I'm at f11. I'm just going to get Karis to fit in my frame, and we'll take a look at the soft lighting look that 150 octabox gives. We can see the fall off of light on the right hand side here going into shadow. So the first thing we can do if we want to fill that light is use a reflector. Right, so if you're in a smaller space with a white wall, then you're going to have a lot of fill light from that single light. Take the shot again. So now you can see in here a lot softer lighting. Now another way you can make this side darker, even with a white wall, is simply to bring your light closer. Keep going, 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 and a bit more, and a bit more. Yep, okay, hold it about there because I can just start to see the light now. Now take 1 stop off of that light, please, in power. So if we compare the 2 shots, so I took 1 stop off by moving the light in and closer, and we've gone from that to that, and look at the difference in the background, the exposure on the background and the exposure on the right side of the face. So if we zoom in on the face, I'm just going to zoom back out a tiny bit to there, and we compare the 2. So look at the contrast difference between this shot and that shot. And what we see in this first shot that we did, that one that's on screen now, is what I would call your typical boring looking lighting that most photographers run with because they don't think about how close they should put the softbox. They normally put it at a distance that feels like it gives the model a bit of space or the photographer a bit of space, or it just sort of feels right. But actually, when you bring your softboxes in uncomfortably close to the model and then adjust the exposure, you get a better result as we have there. So there's the hair light now, which you can see the spotlight on the floor. That's the tight grid. So we're just controlling it with a tight beam. Focusing on Karis, taking the shot. Let's have a look at that hair light. So we have a 2-light setup. A really simple but beautifully lit portrait, lovely and soft, with relatively nice fill light on this side from that simple lighting setup. So the light is harder because the softbox is further away, the fill is greater, and you can see how it works much, much more beautiful when that light is really, really soft. Now, if you want to add a little bit more drama, then we don't even need a big 150 octabox. Let's have the 75 octabox round here. So we've still got the hair light on the other side. Take a shot. Right, so the exposure is about the same, but you can see how much more high contrast that light is in the face now because of its size. So if we bring that into here, you can see it's a much, much higher contrast light than we had in the previous shot there. Let's just zoom in on those a little bit. So there's the one we had before. And now with the smaller light, you can see that much greater contrast. Even the shadow side is obviously a lot greater contrast as well. Right, we're gonna change it completely now. Okay, you can't get much harder light source than a bare bulb. The interesting thing is, it won't seem as hard as you might expect because other stuff is happening with the physics here, okay? Have a think about what's happening. Here's our light source, creating these lovely, strong, hard shadows, but the shadows aren't really jet black and the floor is illuminated over here because the light is also hitting the ceiling, hitting the walls, hitting over there. It's all bouncing around everywhere, which means that it won't actually be as high contrast as it could. So I can make Karis look really nice, or I can make her look really bad. And I'm pretty sure you don't want the really bad option, do you? But unfortunately, I have to show it for one shot, all right? Right, so here's the worst thing you could have done. Look at that shadow from the nose there. You see how that shadow's going up in the air at an angle, not very nice at all. But we're gonna show you with our little special box how we can change things and create a little bit more atmosphere and mood. There, right, keep it there. Refocus, take the shot again. Now, the lighting look has changed. This is where you can play around a little bit now. So you can actually, here we've made a little flap, so we can open up a little bit of light. We'll change the look and feeling of the contrast just from the extra light. There you go. The extra light bouncing off of the studio ceiling changes it again. So open that slit of light, a bit more. There, let's see if that works. Right, perfect. Right, so here we've got the hard light, but we've blocked most of the light from the studio. Now, if these guys move even closer to Karis and make that gap again, that shadow line will be even harder on Karis than it is now. Let's have a look at that exposure level. There we go, that's beautiful, really interesting. Now this is just a bare bulb light with a snoot on it, 2 pieces of card. We're gonna move on to a different lighting example. Now a lot of times we always think about using these softboxes at a 45-degree angle, but it's actually quite nice to use them horizontal. Here's the 3120. It's thin, 30 centimeters here, 120 that way. It's a really nice light for portraits in a horizontal position at a 45-degree angle when you set the light horizontally, but here we're using the actual front surface horizontally. Now, if I use it here, it's gonna look absolutely awful in that position because of all the directional light, the texture and everything else. Terrible way of using it there. And Karis doesn't want that, and neither do I. So, we're gonna use it for something else. We're gonna use it to light the hair and the shoulders. So we're gonna, notice there it clips the nose. It's highlighting the nose because the nose obviously is more forwards on the face. So we move it backwards. At some point the nose won't be it anymore, but just the hair will be. So you can see at that point, just the hair and shoulders. Now none of the face is in the exposure. Let's take a look at it. We'll have to guess the exposure. There it is, there's the hair light. We can bring it into a relatively flattering position here. Lock that focus. Let's take that shot again. Let's just check that. Right, there it is. That's good. Lovely. Right, turn the hair light one off a moment, please, and then press the test button. Just to show how much difference that extra hair light makes to the mood of the shot. So we take that off. Now what will happen is the background is going to be somewhat darker, as you can see there. Considerably darker. The exposure on the face remains much the same. The catch lights are all good. But you can see there's the difference with the hair light and the spread of that hair light onto the floor and the background behind. So you can now say to yourself, once you've checked and controlled the light separately, you can now say to yourself, right, I'm going to play around with the level of that. We're going to half the amount of light that we've got there. So it keeps moving focus. We're going to take a stop off. So this would be a stop darker. There you go on the hair light. Now that actually looks really nice now. Without it, it's just like that. There's nothing at all. Just a little bit of bounce back of reflection off the front of the softbox. Here, we got a little bit more control. And it was like that before, and the amount of spill onto the floor. Here, it gains a little bit of mood, a little bit of atmosphere, but we've still got a little bit of something from that hair light.
Ya, itu untuk yang foto model. Nah, untuk membangun narasi visual, pemilihan subjek yang relevan, pengaturan latar belakang yang menceritakan, penggunaan komposisi yang tepat, memilih momen yang signifikan, menggunakan seri foto, penggunaan efek editing yang bijaksana. Ini salah satu untuk contoh foto dalam rangka ini ya, merah-merah ya, Jinja kemarin. Kalau ini untuk tema foto makanan tapi berada di pantai. Jadi untuk pencahayaannya juga terlihat keras seperti terang sekali, seperti lagi di pantai. Tapi padahal ini di restoran. Lalu kalau yang ini untuk temanya Lebaran dengan tema hijau-hijau dan ketupat.
Didn't know what that looked like when I was a kid, but as time went on, I realized that photography was where my passion was. One of the really big benefits to working with continuous lighting is the fact that you can see exactly what the product is going to look like. Having this live view and being able to really craft your light is a good way to go. Photoshop is an essential tool in advertising photography. That's really how you can perfect images. The retouching, the creativity, the color grading, just all of that stuff really comes together. I'm gonna hit Command J to duplicate it. And I'm just going to double click on it. And I'm gonna sample one of these oranges. And what that's gonna do is it's gonna basically just change the color of the background.
Earlier this year, we met up with Brian to create an F-Stoppers original free tutorial that just lives on YouTube. And it ended up being one of the most popular free lessons that we have ever filmed. And so after we saw the reception of that video, we knew we had to do a full tutorial with Brian.
Now we've duplicated the same image and gave the appearance that we had a group of these all shot together, all perfectly lit. But in product photography, you want to get creative, right? You'd be surprised what little things you can do that could take a shot to the next level. I guess one of the more difficult things to work with as a product photographer is when you've got multiple surfaces on the same product. Not all products are just all chrome or all matte finish. Sometimes products have multiple surfaces and you've got to find a creative way to light each part of those. So you'll notice that we've got a lot of high key white going on at the bottom. What I want to do is minimize that completely. What we can do is like shape the light a little bit better. So let's just bring this in. We're gonna place it on set. Let's take a quick shot here and see what we have. This gives us some options to play with. Sometimes when you're on set and you're placing a light, it might look great on certain areas of the image and not so great on others. So when you can use Photoshop to eliminate those areas and blend frames together and exposures, you can create an image that you just could not create in the camera.
What's so exciting about product photography is that literally anybody can do it with any gear and in any size space. We wanted this tutorial to appeal to anybody on any budget.
In the first shot, we used continuous lighting. In the second shot, we moved into speed lights. And now we're gonna be moving into strobes. I use compositing quite a bit. I think it's a really creative way to build files in a smart way that allow flexibility in the end. So if a client changes their decision on placement or anything like that, the file's really flexible and allows you room to move around and change things. One lesson in particular, I decided to shoot a set of bookshelf speakers. And when I did that, you would think that I'd grab both speakers and set up a shot, but I actually just photographed one at multiple angles and then composited the two together, giving me total flexibility in post-production. I'm gonna make it smaller. I'm gonna hold Shift and Alt at the same time. I'm gonna make it a little bit smaller so it appears as if it's behind the speaker. I'm then gonna use the Move tool and just move it over slightly. Now you can see that it's kind of behind the speaker now. And all I wanna do is just go through here in this area and slightly burn down this edge. The nice thing about doing it this way is that we have complete control. If we decide at a later time that we want the speaker out a little bit more, we can do that. In addition to that, we're also maximizing the resolution. We have more resolution doing it this way than we would shooting both speakers at the same time.
Every lesson in this tutorial is...
Itu untuk salah satu contoh produk. Foto produk. Nah, ini penerapan teknik panning. Panning adalah teknik di mana fotografer mengikuti gerakan subjek dengan kamera saat menekan tombol runner. Sebelum mengambil gambar dengan teknik panning, fotografer perlu memastikan bahwa pengaturan kamera mereka telah disesuaikan. Nah, pemilihan kecepatan runner yang tepat sangat penting dalam teknik panning. Salah satu keindahan dan teknik adalah kemampuannya untuk menciptakan gambar yang kreatif dan ekspresif. Seperti contoh ini ya. Kemarin Mas Irfan udah foto ya, foto truk ya, foto panning. Gitu.
Ya, sudah, Pak.
Iya.
Mencoba.
Cakep, cakep.
I'm Alejandro Cerezuela. I'm a motorsports photographer, and now I'm working and traveling with the MotoGP World Championship. For me, when I think on MotoGP, the first idea that it's come to my mind is speed. Speed, risk, adrenaline. And that's the first thing that I want to show with the pictures. I have to be fast in everything. I think it's faster than the bikes, the Sony A9. Every picture I try to do, I can do it. My first time with the A9 and my first feeling was, it's amazing. I can focus in all the screen, the speed was incredible. I mean, bikes are fast. If the camera doesn't focus fast, I don't use this camera. This is about moments. There are moments that are in a millisecond. For example, with a rider that is riding with the elbow on the ground. In other sports, you have more time, or the actions are more repeated. But here, there's 1 lap or 2 laps that riders give the 150%. 20 frames per second helps you to get these moments, to get closer to these moments. What I do is show a story with pictures. I think every story has to be told with a lens. Sometimes I want to show a big grandstand or inside the box. If I want to show all the mechanics working, the 12mm works perfect for me. For me, the best thing about the system is that I'm covered from 12mm to 800. There's no situation that I cannot shoot with the A9. When I do panning shots, I try to play with the background. The image stabilization helps a lot. You can shoot with no monopod at 120. The focus speed is incredible. There's no blackout. It's easy to follow the rider. It's easy to track everything. It's not nice to work when it's raining, but for the picture results, I love it. Water adds some emotion because you cannot believe that they are riding this way. I'm not worried about shooting under the rain with the Sony A9 because it's a well-built camera. I rely 100% on the camera. With the A9, you can get pictures that with other camera you cannot. There are moments that I think I've taken the perfect shot, and when you get the picture and you are on the track, that moment is amazing.
Oke, tadi pending ya. Banyakan di motor gitu ya, bagus ya. Lalu kita menggunakan teknik long exposure. Long exposure adalah teknik di mana kamera dibiarkan terbuka untuk jangka waktu yang lebih lama dari biasanya, yang memungkinkan cahaya masuk ke sensor dalam jumlah yang lebih besar. Ada juga dengan filter ND atau neutral density. Sering digunakan dalam long exposure untuk mengurangi jumlah cahaya masuk ke dalam kamera, sehingga memungkinkan penggunaan kecepatan rana yang lebih lambat, bahkan dalam kondisi pencahayaan yang terang. Nah, pengaturan aperture juga penting dalam long exposure. Salah satu aspek yang menarik dari long exposure adalah kemampuannya untuk menciptakan efek yang unik dengan merekam pergerakan objek dalam frame. Contohnya ini untuk long exposure ya. Oke. Ini tadi juga long exposure untuk foto aliran-aliran danau, air gitu. Jadi lebih soft kayak bentuk rambut ya, hair gitu. Ini pergerakan dalam kendaraan.
Today, me and my friends are going to be doing a long exposure photography battle. So essentially a long exposure is when the shutter is open for an extended amount of time in order to let more light into the sensor. In doing so, you can create really cool effects like painting with light, light trails, motion blur, all kinds of stuff. Now that we're back in Melbourne, why not do a long exposure photo battle with myself, Mike and Faye?
Long exposures is like my bread and butter. Like,
I just don't know what sort of effect creates. I think it will be just a lot of trial and error.
Maybe we should start this creativity off with a bang and hopefully a few bangs. Lovely, what's going on? Hope you're doing well today. If you haven't seen the photo battle series before, what we do is we start off in the same location, we spread off into different parts of that location to try and take as many cool photos as possible. Then we come back to the same location, we edit up the photos, we put it up on our Instagram stories for you to vote. We only have 3 hours, and if you're any later than those 3 hours, you're disqualified. The rule is to take long exposures only. And the loser of this photo battle has to busk in front of however many people, which will be probably pretty embarrassing, especially because we haven't done it before. Are you guys ready? Let's do it. All right, let's go. Let's get it. You think you're gonna win? Mate, I know I'm gonna win. How confident are you on a scale of 1 to 10? 1. I want to get a shot doing a long exposure of like a light going around the head so it creates a halo, but I don't want it to be a white halo, I want it to be red. We need to like cover it with some sort of red substance, so maybe like cellophane or something. Maybe there's a Daiso somewhere. We'll look for that.
We'll do like a big long exposure and then maybe we come back this way to do some of like tram train as it gets a bit darker.
so I was thinking of trying something like this.
Oh, that's super clean.
There's a Daiso Japan that's closing soon. We have to get there ASAP.
I feel a bit overwhelmed because I have not really a plan, but we'll figure it out. The plan will come to us.
Long exposure with people. Okay, so let's just focus on that first and then we'll go from there.
One really cool trick you can do is if you have the camera really steady, you hit the shutter and then you zoom out maybe after 2 seconds and then let it take the photo, and then you've got this cool zoom of light.
It's cool, like the idea is cool, but it's just hard to get. Man, good. What's your name? Jacob. Walk with me.
Watched you for a few years now.
Oh, really? So we're actually doing a photo battle now.
You are?
Yeah,
Shit.
Would you want to come take photos?
Yeah, I'm down to come hang out for a bit.
Yeah, sure. Okay,
Alright, cool.
No worries. Daiso. Oh no! closed.
It came from work, so I've got like lighting and stuff, like tube lights and like little mini square lights and stuff. So
Yes! Oh, that's so good. I'm hating it. Going, right? Oh shit! I forgot that it was on 5 seconds. It's still going. Mint! We got the shot, boys. We got the shot.
What have they done to me spot? This next scene of the video is all made in Blender. It's VFX. This shot better be worth it.
I'm thinking 50mm for this spot because my aperture can be 1.4. So now that makes no sense. I have no idea. We'll figure it out. It's not really working out because we need people to walk in front.
Okay, using a tripod is just gonna be way better. 1, 2. Oh, that's actually shit. Oh, that would have been. Oh,
yes.
Okay, that's way
what
better.
I was talking about. Would hate to get a spider on me.
Fuck. Everybody is like, oh, I'm not gonna walk in front of the camera.
Put my camera on the ground and you shoot my lens, and then you get that long exposure reflecting in a lens instead of glass.
I hope they come frequent here, the trams, because we don't have as much time, of course.
I'm definitely gonna get.
A little bit, yeah, right there, that's perfect, yeah.
Oh fuck, is there security? Just hiding behind a bush.
I hope it will reflect.
I've got this thing as well.
What is that?
What the hell is that? So it's like a...
Ah, okay.
We can also take like a higher shutter speed one and then just like merge it. Look over your shoulder at me, kind of thing.
Just...
Do I focus it on the camera?
I think focus on the camera.
Yeah.
Oh fuck. Damn it, it's such a good shot here. Nah. It's a long exposure, it's gonna take ages to get.
Okay, perfect.
It's not gonna do anything.
Is there any reflection at all in the camera?
Nah, not really.
He's yelling security.
I'm on the Hamer Hall side.
Ah, that's where he's coming right now. There's 2 more security guys.
Fuck.
3, 2, 1. Oh, that's sick.
All right, I'll just make a bunch of it.
It's actually looking all right.
Is he running?
From here?
Lucky we've had a good day. And we couldn't bloody put on. We've got a bloody good camera there. Just beware if anything's fenced off and it's got signs on it.
This used to be a really good photo spot. Sorry, guys.
Unfortunately, it's a death trap, yeah?
You guys take it easy. Sorry about that. All right, that was not worth it. At least they were chill and they weren't cops. Otherwise, I'd be in jail right now.
The funniest thing is, can you please help me carry the camera?
Nah.
You're good?
We'll be able to make this work for sure. First shot done. On to the next one.
The only other option with this one is shooting wider, but I don't know if you want to waste time doing another one here or move on.
I was thinking that up high would be cool though.
Up high would be way better.
I don't know. It's not my favorite shot, but I feel like it has potential to be my favorite shot. Ah, bit of brainstorming is needed. I wonder what Hayden's up to.
Yeah. All the legs in there short. Nah, this is dodgy as shit. There's no way that we're doing that. Okay, look. I vote not to do this location because it's going to be really hard to do.
By me.
I think it's pretty hard. Yeah.
Here we are. I'm not fucking losing. Sweet, that'll do it.
I think that honestly, I think we should do the halo thing. Yeah. I need to find a different location.
Whenever I think of light painting, I kind of think of very simple locations, and then like the actual painting itself is the interesting part.
Because otherwise, if there's too many lights, it takes away from the light painting. Okay. So maybe a relatively dark location, an alleyway. or something.
I know that Faye hasn't had that much experience shooting long exposures, so sort of interested to see how she's going to do. But
what do you think?
Yeah, cool work. Yeah, we'll just see if they have to see in the edits, but I'm happy we tried.
How'd that work?
I feel like we sort of have to get a little bit lucky with this shot because it's so busy right now.
Hopefully this like stays on, but like, oh.
Did it just die?
Oh, you're kidding.
That looks nice. I like that a lot.
That looks very nice.
We're doing it, guys!
Yeah. Looking that way?
That's nice. That's crazy.
Yeah, that's a bit better.
Actually looks really good, bro.
Yeah. Wait, it's actually like not turning on.
It turns on and it turns off.
Oh no. It's like you turn it on, then like you pose it, but then it doesn't. How are we supposed to do it? I'm gonna go get my LumaCube. Let's try that. Let's see. Does it fit? Does it fit?
Itu untuk yang fotografi malam dengan trail light ya. Nah, ini juga ada lighting trail fotografi. Teknik di mana fotografer menggunakan kecepatan terana yang lambat untuk merekam jejak, cahaya, dan objek bergerak. Pengaturan kamera harus disesuaikan untuk mencapai efek jejak cahaya yang diinginkan. Ini melibatkan pengaturan kecepatan terana yang lambat, biasanya beberapa detik. Nah, penutupan aperture yang sesuai dan pengaturan ISO yang rendah untuk mengurangi noise. Penggunaan tripod atau stabilizer lainnya sangat penting dalam trail light untuk menghindari goyangan kamera yang dapat merusak hasil akhir. Nah, panjang exposure yang lebih lama akan menghasilkan jejak cahaya yang lebih panjang dan lebih dramatis. Sementara panjang exposure yang lebih pendek akan menghasilkan jejak cahaya yang lebih pendek dan lebih tajam. Menggunakan teknik light painting, persiapkan sebelum pengambilan gambar, pengaturan kecepatan rana yang tepat, menggunakan sumber cahaya yang beragam, ekspresi, eksperimen dengan gerakan dan pola, kreativitas dan imajinasi. Contohnya dengan light painting, yang ini tadi ya juga dengan ini, neon-neonnya. Ini contoh untuk light painting. Oke, tadi trilight ya. Oke. Nah, ini juga ada menerapkan teknik HDR atau High Dynamic Range. Tujuan utamanya adalah menciptakan gambar dengan detail yang kaya, baik di area highlight terang maupun shadow gelap. Nah, proses pengambilan gambar HDR melibatkan pengambilan beberapa exposure dengan tingkat pencahayaan yang berbeda untuk mencakup seluruh rentang dinamis dari area terang hingga gelap. Nah, setelah pengambilan gambar exposure yang berbeda tersebut kemudian diolah dengan perangkat lunak HDR. Saat menggunakan teknik HDR, perlu dihindari efek yang terlalu berlebihan atau terlihat tidak alami. Nah, teknik bracketing adalah metode di mana kamera secara otomatis mengambil beberapa exposure dengan nilai exposure yang berbeda. Teknik HDR juga dapat digunakan secara kreatif untuk memberikan efek visual yang menarik. Berikut contoh-contoh teknik HDR ya. Ini untuk pemandangan gitu bagus ya.
Well, HDR photography is a technique where we take values. We then take those different exposures, those separate images, and we merge them together to create one final image which captures a wider tonal range than we would normally get in the single image. Now that may sound very complicated, so let's go back to basics. So to help explain what is meant by a high dynamic range, I've set the camera up in a different part of the office, and I've chosen this spot because of the big windows here. I've also set the camera up to expose for me and this grey card. If we look at this grey card, you will see 6 individual squares, white through to black, and you should be able to make out every single square. Now, the big problem with this room, of course, is there's lots more light going on outside. The outside area is overexposed. Now, the camera cannot capture those bright areas and the light in this room, which is significantly lower at the same time. The only way we can do this with still photography is to take a series of images, and this is where HDR comes in. So I'm not doing stills at the moment, I'm doing a video. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the exposure settings on the camera now to compensate for the windows. So what I'm effectively going to do, I'm going to get up, I'm going to increase the shutter speed, and you will see that as I increase the shutter speed, we let less light into the camera and we start to improve the exposure on the light coming through the windows. That looks pretty good now. So now you can see the clouds and the detail in the windows, but you can't see me anymore. This is the problem with light and areas or scenes that have a high dynamic range. So if we can't capture everything in a single image, we simply take a standard image for the midtones, a second image that is intentionally underexposed but retains the highlights, and a third image that is overexposed and reveals details in the shadows. Now, using suitable software, in this case Lightroom, we can merge the 3 exposures together to create a high dynamic range image. Now, before I show you how to merge the images together to create one HDR image, it's time to talk camera settings. Now, there's a couple of ways in which you can do this. One is to use a technique called bracketing. Now, I actually made a video all about bracketing just a few weeks back, and I think it's a video you should definitely check out. So I'll put a link in the description below this video, and I'll also pop one up here for you as well. But another technique, and the one that I'm going to feature in this video, is to go full manual. Now, because in Brisbane we're currently in lockdown, I'm going to demonstrate how to do this here in the office. So for this first demonstration, we're going to use a Nikon camera. In a moment, I will do the same with a Canon camera. This is a Nikon D3500 set to the manual mode, and we have here the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. The first thing we're going to do is make sure the ISO is low. Default for me is usually 200. Next thing I'm going to do is adjust the aperture. Now, which aperture you use is up to you, but I'm going to select f8 by holding down the button on the top of the camera and dialing to the right. F8 should give me a nice sharp image with a decent depth of field. So the next thing I'm going to do is adjust the camera's shutter speed, and this is where the light meter come in. Here you have the minus side, here the plus side. We want to aim for the 0. Plus is too bright, minus is too dark, 0 is balanced. At the moment the meter is telling us we're going to be overexposed, so I'm going to increase the shutter speed by dialing to the right with the dial. you'll see the shutter speed increases, and if you keep an eye on the camera's light meter, it will start to move to the middle, and when it hits the middle, it means that according to the camera we should have a balanced exposure. So this is picture number 1. Focus, take the picture. Press the shutter to reset, and we're now going to take 2 more photos. Remember, for the next picture we want to be underexposed, so I'm increasing the shutter speed. This lets less light into the camera, and you'll see the meter now reads that we're doing a minus exposure, or we're under by 1 stop. Picture number 2. Press the shutter button to clear the screen once again, dialing to the left resets the meter, but I want an overexposed picture for number 3, so I'm going to keep dialing to the left. 3 clicks gives me an overexposure of 1 stop. Focus, take the picture, and we've now got 3 images. Over, under, balanced. So we're now going to do exactly the same thing with a Canon camera, starting with the ISO. I'm going to set it to 200, which again is generally my default. Then we're going to look at the aperture, holding down the AV button and turning the dial on the camera. It allows us to change the aperture on the Canon camera. Again, I'm going to dial in f8. Then we need to check the meter. On the Canon cameras, just press the shutter button lightly. It wakes up the meter and you'll see a marker appear and then disappear. It's over to the plus side, which means at the moment we're going to overexpose. So I'm going to press the button again to wake up the meter, dial to the right to increase the shutter speed. This affects the meter. Once it's in the middle, we can take picture number 1. Slight adjustment. Picture number 1 done. And then just like with the Nikon, we're now going to do our underexposed image by increasing the shutter speed. You'll see the meter react. Once we're at the -1, this is 1 stop under, we can take picture number 2. Focus. Picture number 2. And once again, because we want to do now an overexposed image, we're going to dial to the left to slow the shutter down. This takes us back to 0. And another 3 clicks to the left will take us to the +1, which is 1 stop overexposed. Focus, press the button, picture number 3. So now we've got our 3 images, our over, under and balanced exposure. Now when taking your images, a really good tip is to use a tripod to keep the camera steady and maybe avoid shooting subjects where there is movement. This will help the software merge your images together seamlessly. Now once you've got your images, all you've got to do is import them into some software to turn them into an HDR image. I'm going to demonstrate this for you using Adobe Lightroom. Now don't worry if you don't have Lightroom, there is a free trial available on their website, plus there's lots of other HDR software options available, and I'll list some of the more popular ones in the description below this video. Okay, so all I've done so far is imported the 3 images into Lightroom. Over to the left we have our first image, which is all about the mid-tones. The second image is all about the highlights. It is an underexposed image. And number 3 is the overexposed image, which blows out the highlights but is great for bringing out the shadow detail. Now what we're going to do is we're going to merge the 3 images together to create a single HDR image. And to do this, I'm going to start by highlighting the 3 images. I'm then going to go up to Photo, down to Photo Merge, select HDR. Now the first thing Lightroom's going to do is create a preview. This may take a few moments depending on how large the image files are. Now once you have your preview, you can select which deghost amount. Deghosting is all about getting rid of things that may have moved while you were taking your 3 exposures. I've got mine set to low here. So I'm now going to click on to merge. And after a few moments, we now have our preview. So let's just shrink these down. So we're going to go through the images in sequence. So this is our normal image, this is our underexposed, this is our overexposed, and this is our HDR image.
Oke, berikut contoh untuk yang HDR. Gitu. Oke, dari Mas Irfan ada yang mau ditanyain?
Udah ada, Pak.
Nggak ada.
Udah ada.
Oke, oke.
Kita langsung absen dulu kali ya Pak ya?
Boleh, boleh. Mau di absen dulu ya.
operator boleh dipandu Kak buat absensinya.
Baik, terima kasih kepada Pak Nanda, Pak Rudi, dan Betes. Kita langsung saja ya, di sesi foto ketiga di sesi 5 ini. Dengan hitungan 3, 2, 1. Baik, terima kasih kepada Pak Nanda, Pak Rudi, dan Betes. Silakan dan lanjutkan untuk materi.
Baik, terima kasih.
Sama-sama.
Itu gimana Pak?
Ya.
Mas Irfan minta nomor Pak Rudi tuh.
Oh iya, boleh, nggak apa.
Ya.
Ini saya tulis aja ya, 081.
Oke.
Ya, Pak. 1572.
Aku sambil
Ini Mas, sudah saya kirim Mas, nomor WhatsApp saya.
Ada beberapa. Mas Irfan, pertemuan terakhir nih. Jadi ada beberapa tugas dan link-link yang harus Mas Irfan isi sih. Jadi seperti biasa di sesi 5 ada formatif test juga. Terus di sesi 5 ini ada ujian akhir. Nah, ujian akhirnya ini pilihan ganda, Mas. 10 soal gampang pilihan ganda. Sama unjuk keterampilan. Nah, unjuk keterampilan ini dia itu petunjuknya ada di online.gitu.id. Biar aku sekalian tunjukin. Nah, Mas Irfan tinggal buka sesi 5. Sesi 5.
Iya.
Ini ada kuis, kayak biasa kuis. Terus scroll lagi ke bawah, ada ujian akhir. Nah, ini pilihan ganda, Mas. Pilihan ganda. Terus sama nih. Yang di bawahnya unduh sertifikat instruksi unjuk keterampilan. Nah, di sini ada. Cuman ini masih loading. Nah, soal-soalnya ada di sini semua. Tinggal di cross aja. Gimana? Ada pertanyaan, Mas Irfan?
Paham Mas. Oh iya,
Oke,
untuk yang mau nanya sebentar Mas. Untuk yang di prakerja kan masih belum ada hijaunya. Nah itu nanti berarti nunggu dulu ya Mas? Modelnya.
Ya. Paling kalau misalnya udah beberapa hari nggak ada hijaunya, bisa kabarin operator GT sih, Mas. Nah.
Oke, siap Mas. Makasih
Sama ini
informasi.
jangan lupa tulis review ya, Mas ya. Tulis review.
Oke, siap.
Kasih rating juga.
Yang paling
Sama
terbaik.
Terima kasih Mas Irfan.
Sama reflektif jurnal nih. Ada 2 pertanyaan. Oke, Mas Irfan.
Oke, siap Mas.
Sama yang terakhir nih, ada di link absen ada feedback form. Formnya ngisi formulir seperti biasa. Oke.
Siap.
Ada tambahan. Langsung tutup aja ya, Pak Rudi.
Boleh. Iya.
Oke.
Aku langsung tutup ya Mas Irfan ya. Apa masih ada pertanyaan?
Udah aman Mas. Terima kasih Mas untuk
Aman ya.
5 hari
Terima
ini.
kasih Mas
Nomor WA juga udah dapat tuh
Irfan.
kayaknya. Oke. Linknya udah ada di kolom chat Zoom ya Mas ya. Aku langsung tutup aja. Oke, Geters, tidak terasa durasi webinar kita sudah selesai. Maka dari itu, sekian kelas webinar LPKGT Info hari ini bersama tenaga pelatih Bapak Rudi Yanuar. Dalam kelas, merancang visual multimedia dan fotografi. Jangan lupa isi absen dengan klik link sudah kami bagikan di kolom chat Zoom, mengerjakan kuis, post test, serta mengerjakan unjuk keterampilan karena ini menjadi salah satu syarat Geters untuk mendapatkan sertifikat penyelesaian. Informasi tambahan. Untuk Geters, jika ada keluarga, kerabat, atau saudara yang masih memiliki saldo prakerja, belum membeli pelatihan, boleh diajak untuk membeli pelatihan di LPKGT Inkubator. Karena masih banyak sekali pilihan kelas atau topik yang menarik di LPKGT Inkubator. Sekali lagi, kami ucapkan terima kasih karena telah memilih LPKGT Inkubator sebagai tempat pelatihan Geters dalam program Kartu Prakerja. Saya, Emran Rafli Ridwan, pamit undur diri. Terima kasih. Salam belajar, semoga Mas Irfan sukses, semoga ilmu-ilmunya bermanfaat, semoga bisa terus sharing-sharing sama Pak Rudi karena udah dapat nomor itu kan. Mohon maaf bila ada salah kata, kalimat, atau Mohon maaf bila ada kata ataupun kalimat yang kurang berkenan di hati. Sampai jumpa kembali Mas Irfan. Salam belajar. Terima kasih Mas
Terima kasih Mas
Irfan. Terima
Yumas,
kasih
terima
Pak
kasih
Budi.
Mas Anda. Selamat malam.
Nama saya Astin Atsna, saya adalah pendiri dari PT Hijau Inovasi. Kita tidak hanya berdagang, tapi memang kita membangun bisnis. Kita membangun bisnis bukan hanya berdagang, beli dari pedagang kita jual lagi. Tapi memang saya targetnya itu membangun bisnis di gula kelapa. Kenapa gula kelapa? Karena Banyumas potensinya sangat besar. Di bulan September kita melakukan ekspor ke beberapa tempat, salah satunya memang kita ke Bahrain ya. Bahrain itu buyer barunya kita dan kita sangat bersyukur dapat Bahrain karena apa? Meskipun mereka baru trial order sekitar 500 kilo ya, yang namanya buyer itu pasti pertama trial order. Itu mereka 500 kilo dan yang membuat kita juga sangat bersyukur itu selain dia buyer baru di era pandemi seperti ini juga saya agak cukup terkejut karena dia mau dengan harga yang lumayan tinggi. Kedepannya harapannya memang tetap akan ada kolaborasi antara local hero ataupun program yang lainnya, di mana nanti harapannya akun kita itu masih bisa lebih baik lagi, lebih aktif lagi. Indonesia berani ekspor.
Saya Ferry Sabtowibowo dari KUB Sentral Agro Lestari. Kita berdiri di sini karena dari keprihatinan dari KUB Sentral Agro Lestari terhadap petani-petani gula merah di Desa Bumisari. Karena dari tahun-tahun sebelumnya, sebelum kami ada, kami merasa prihatin terhadap kehidupan para petani di mana mereka berjuang demi keluarganya, mempertaruhkan nyawanya, tetapi harga dari gula merah yang mereka produksi tidak sesuai. Karena tekad kami untuk bisa mengangkat kehidupan para petani, kami terus menggali informasi dan ternyata memang potensi gula merah di tingkat nasional, kemudian di internasional juga potensinya sangat besar. Makanya kami terus belajar, kami terus menggali informasi, biar kami bertekad mensejahterakan para petani di Desa Bumisari dengan kami mempunyai tekad untuk bisa mengekspor sendiri. Intinya dengan adanya local hero di KUB Sentral Agro Lestari, kami sangat merasa terbantu sekali untuk bisa lebih memasarkan produk-produk gula kelapa organik kita di pasar internasional. Indonesia berani ekspor.
Perkenalkan, saya Koko Haryadi, Direktur PT Sistema Organis Agrinaya sekaligus sebagai owner. Di sini ada banyak potensi industri gula kelapa di Barli Mas Cakep, Banyumas, Purbalingga, Banjarnegara, Kebumen, dan Cilacap. Dan banyak industri rumah tangga membuat gula kelapa ini yang potensinya sangat besar sebagai pemanis alternatif yang sehat. Di zaman digital sekarang ini memang kita perlu inovasi ya. dalam melakukan pemasaran. Jadi e-commerce marketplace itu juga sangat penting untuk melakukan pemasaran. Banyak sekali beberapa buyer yang memang sebenarnya sangat tertarik dengan produk kita. Beberapa buyer yang sudah kita kirim sampelnya, pertama itu Malaysia, terus Italia, Amerika, dan terakhir kemarin kita juga mengirim sampel ke Ghana yang harapannya ke depan itu setelah harga kapal bisa normal, nanti bisa ada follow up untuk transaksi. Indonesia berani ekspor.
Nama saya Nartam Andanusa, saya dari Koperasi Serba Usaha Nira Satria di Kabupaten Banyumas. Saya sebagai anak petani gula kelapa di Kabupaten Banyumas, saya merasakan bagaimana permasalahan yang terjadi di petani gula itu cukup kompleks ya. Di antaranya adalah kualitas yang jelek, kemudian harga yang kurang stabil, kemudian masih terikat dengan pengepul atau tengkulak, dan juga akses pasar yang susah. Pasar terbesar kami adalah di Eropa, itu cukup besar ya, ada kurang lebih 80% market kami di Eropa. Kemudian ada beberapa pasar yang lain, yaitu ada di benua Asia, kemudian di Afrika, kemudian juga ada ke Amerika. Kami mengucapkan banyak terima kasih sudah mendampingi kami dalam menjalankan bisnis kami. Indonesia berani ekspor.